Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another scary story, your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now get comfortable and relax. We moved into the house in late autumn, just as the leaves were turning brittle and red like blood drying on pavement. It was a beautiful home, despite its age, a wooden structure with deep brown walls and a wraparound porch that creaked underfoot. The house sat on 2 acres of land, one for the house and yard, the other for a pond that reflected the sky like a shattered mirror on still days. A barn stood off to the side, its doors warped from years of rain and neglect, but I loved it. It was the perfect place for my experiments, the kind that required space and secrecy. The moment we pulled into the driveway, I felt something off about the place. Not wrong, necessarily, but still, silent, like the house had been waiting for us, watching. I didn't mention it. Instead, I focused on picking a room. I'd always wanted an upstairs bedroom, so I rushed ahead of my brother, staking my claim before he could. The walls of my new room were a dull beige, but I already imagined painting them a deep blue. My old room had been lavender, a color I had grown to hate, for reasons I could never fully explain. Everyone picked their rooms quickly, excited to settle in, but there was one room left unclaimed. It was upstairs, across the hall from mine. No one wanted it. At first, I thought nothing of it. Every house had that one room, the one too small or oddly shaped to be useful. But standing outside its closed door, a strange unease crept up my spine. I pushed the door open. The air inside was thick, stagnant, as if it hadn't moved in years. The room was small, with no windows, and the ceiling hung oppressively low. The only thing that stood out was the ceiling fan. Each blade painted a different color: blue, red, yellow, green, and orange. It reminded me of a child's bedroom, but an abandoned one, where laughter had long since faded. A weight settled on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I didn't want to be there. I turned on my heel and left, closing the door behind me with more force than necessary. That night, exhaustion took me quickly. I barely registered the softness of my new bed before sleep claimed me. Then I woke up. It wasn't a noise that roused me, but rather a feeling, a pressure. Then I heard it, children laughing. At first, I thought it was my brother, playing some horror game with his speakers turned up. But the sound was different, distant, like it wasn't coming from inside the house, but rather within the walls. A soft lullaby followed. I turned onto my side, pulling my blanket up to my chin, refusing to acknowledge the way my heart pounded. I squeezed my eyes shut and convinced myself it was nothing. Morning arrived without incident. Sunlight filtered through my window, golden and warm, as if the night before had only been a dream. I pushed the memory aside. My parents were out for the day, running errands and getting supplies. Left to my own devices, I found myself wandering back to that room. The unease from yesterday still lingered, but curiosity tugged at me. I stepped inside. The walls were covered in old white wallpaper, yellowed at the edges. On a whim, I picked at a loose corner near the door and pulled. The paper peeled away easily, revealing a pastel wall beneath. Floral designs curled in soft, looping patterns. My pulse quickened as I tore away more wallpaper, uncovering the true room beneath. Each wall was a different pastel shade, a child's room, without a doubt. Then, as more wallpaper crumbled to the floor, I saw them, paintings of children. 3 figures stood out, just 2 girls and a boy, playing together, frozen in time. The artwork was detailed, delicate, too intricate to be dismissed as simple decorations. My stomach twisted. These children had been drawn with care. Love. But there were more figures, faded and less defined, like ghosts lingering in the background. Crayon scribbles covered parts of the walls, I grabbed a brush and scrubbed at the marks, trying to erase them, but some stains refused to fade. That's when I knew I had to find out more. I sat at my desk and searched for my new address online. A Wikipedia page popped up. I clicked the link. My stomach lurched as I read. George Ashford built this house in 1926, dreaming of a long life with his wife, Elena. They had triplets, Harvey, Julia, and Allison. But in 1934, tragedy struck. A violent fight led Elena to lock herself in her room and hang herself. The children, who had witnessed the entire thing, retreated to their bedroom. Overcome with grief, each of them took their own life. One by head trauma, one by bleeding out, one by electrocution. George, left alone, drowned himself in the pond. I stared at my screen, heart hammering. The house had been a graveyard for nearly a century. I kept reading. The article mentioned paintings. Portraits George Ashford had CR eated his children, but it said they were never found. That couldn't be right. They were here, right here, on the walls, hidden beneath decades of wallpaper. A shiver crawled up my spine as I scrolled down the page. House last owned 1934. Renovated and repainted 2011. Sold mid-2012. No owner since then. That meant we were the first people to live here in nearly a century. I glanced at the walls again. The painted children stared back at me, their eyes wide and unblinking. A strange thought settled into my mind. Had I disturbed something by peeling back the wallpaper? I swallowed hard and shut my laptop. The house was old, that was all. My mind was running away with ghost stories, and I had spent too much time alone. My parents would be back soon. Everything would be fine. But that night, the laughter returned. It was louder this time. No longer a faint whisper at the edges of my hearing. It echoed softly through the house, curling around me in the dark. Then the lullaby started, the same tinny, old-fashioned tune as before. I pulled the blankets over my head, every muscle in my body tensed, and then footsteps, light, quick footsteps like small, bare feet padding against the hardwood floor. I squeezed my eyes shut. It was my imagination. It had to be. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen in place. Eventually, exhaustion won, pulling me under. The next morning, the house was silent again. I told myself I wouldn't go back into that room, that whatever curiosity had gripped me the day before was gone. But something kept pulling at me. I spent the morning researching more about the Ashford house. The same tragic story repeated across different sites, but one detail caught my attention. Disappearances. Children aged 8 to 18 had gone missing near the house throughout the years. Always children. And then, in the 1990s, it stopped. The house had been condemned for 20 years. But before that, kids would sneak in to explore. Some of them never came back out. A cold dread settled over me. Was that what the paintings meant? Were those extra figures the missing children? I needed to know more. I printed out a few pictures of the missing kids and tucked them into my pocket. Maybe if I compared them to the painted figures, I could find something. That evening, my parents finally came home. I was starving, so I went downstairs to eat. But the moment I stepped into the kitchen, my dad was already there, looking furious. "You could have at least cleaned up." He snapped. I blinked. "What?" "The mess," he said, gesturing behind him. "Look at this disaster." I turned my head and felt my stomach drop. The kitchen was wrecked. Pots and pans covered the counters. Flour dusted the floor. Broken eggs oozed across the tiles. Cupboards stood wide open, their contents spilled like a crime scene. But I hadn't done any of it. "Dad, I didn't..." He cut me off. "I don't want to hear it. Either you're lying or you're so oblivious that someone broke in while you were upstairs. Either way, you need to learn responsibility." "But I swear..." His expression darkened. "Go to the storage room. Now." My breath hitched. "No, not there." He folded his arms. 1, 2. I backed away. "Please, anywhere but there." 3. He grabbed my arm and dragged me to the storage room. I struggled, but he shoved me inside and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. The moment I turned on the light, my breath caught in my throat. The painted children had changed. Their eyes weren't just looking at me now. They were staring into me. The soft, distant giggling started. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then the lullaby started, quiet at first, then growing louder. A sharp, tinny melody, playing from nowhere. I pressed myself against the door. "Dad," I whispered. "Please let me out." No answer. Something cold touches my arm. I jerked away, slamming into the door with a choked gasp. My pockets rustled, and the papers, the missing children's photos, spilled onto the floor. The room fell silent. Then the light flickered. I scrambled to pick up the photos, my fingers shaking. The moment my eyes landed on them, my blood turned to ice. The faces in the photographs. They matched the faded figures in the paintings. The light went out. I screamed. The darkness swallowed me whole. I slammed my fists against the door, screaming for my dad, but I knew he wouldn't come. He thought I was lying. He thought this was some childish tantrum, not the kind of terror that claws up your throat and threatens to choke you. The lullaby played on, tinny and warped, twisting through the pitch-black air, like a whispering breath against my skin. Then came the laughter, soft, high. Edith his children, but it said they were never found. That couldn't be right. They were here, right here on the walls, hidden beneath decades of wallpaper. A shiver crawled up my spine as I scrolled down the page. House last owned 1934, renovated and repainted 2011, sold mid-2012. No owners since then. That meant we were the first people to live here in nearly a century. I glanced at the walls again. The painted children stared back at me, their eyes wide and unblinking. A strange thought settled into my mind. Had I disturbed something by peeling back the wallpaper? I swallowed hard and shut my laptop. The house was old, that was all. My mind was running away with ghost stories, and I had spent too much time alone. My parents would be back soon. Everything would be fine. But that night, the laughter returned. It was louder this time, no longer a faint whisper at the edges of my hearing. It echoed softly through the house, curling around me in the dark. Then the lullaby started, the same tinny, old-fashioned tune as before. I pulled the blankets over my head, every muscle in my body tensed, and then footsteps, light, quick footsteps, like small, bare feet padding against the hardwood floor. I squeezed my eyes shut. It was my imagination. It had to be. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen in place. Eventually, exhaustion won, pulling me under. The next morning, the house was silent again. I told myself I wouldn't go back into that room. That whatever curiosity had gripped me the day before was gone. But something kept pulling at me. I spent the morning researching more about the Ashford house. The same tragic story repeated across different sites, but one detail caught my attention. Disappearances, children aged 8 to 18, had gone missing near the house throughout the years. Always children. And then, in the 1990s, it stopped. The house had been condemned for 20 years. But before that, kids would sneak in to explore. Some of them never came back out. A cold dread settled over me. Was that what the paintings meant? Were those extra figures the missing children? I needed to know more. I printed out a few pictures of the missing kids and tucked them into my pocket. Maybe if I compared them to the painted figures, I could find something. That evening, my parents finally came home. I was starving, so I went downstairs to eat. But the moment I stepped into the kitchen, my dad was already there, looking furious. "You could have at least cleaned up," he snapped. I blinked. "What?" "The mess," he said, gesturing behind him. "Look at this disaster." I turned my head and felt my stomach drop. The kitchen was wrecked. Pots and pans covered the counters, flour dusted the floor. Broken eggs oozed across the tiles. Cupboards stood wide open, their contents spilled like a crime scene. But I hadn't done any of it. "Dad, I didn't..." He cut me off. "I don't want to hear it. Either you're lying or you're so oblivious that someone broke in while you were upstairs. Either way, you need to learn responsibility." "But I swear..." His expression darkened. "Go to the storage room, now." My breath hitched. "No, not there." He folded his arms. 1, 2, I backed away. "Please, anywhere but there." 3. He grabbed my arm and dragged me to the storage room. I struggled, but he shoved me inside and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. The moment I turned on the light, my breath caught in my throat. The painted children had changed. Their eyes weren't just looking at me now, they were staring into me. The soft, distant giggling started. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then the lullaby started, quiet at first, then growing louder. A sharp, tinny melody, playing from nowhere. I pressed myself against the door. "Dad," I whispered, "please let me out." No answer. Something cold touches my arm. I jerked away, slamming into the door. With a choked gasp, my pockets rustled, and the papers, the missing children's photos, spilled onto the floor. The room fell silent. Then the light flickered. I scrambled to pick up the photos, my fingers shaking. The moment my eyes landed on them, my blood turned to ice. The faces in the photographs, they matched the faded figures in the paintings. The light went out. I screamed. The darkness swallowed me whole. I slammed my fists against the door, screaming for my dad, but I knew he wouldn't come. He thought I was lying. He thought this was some childish tantrum, not the kind of terror that claws up your throat and threatens to choke you. The lullaby played on, tinny and warped, twisting through the pitch-black air, like a whispering breath against my skin. Then came the laughter, soft, high, child in frozen play. But I had seen them move. I stepped inside cautiously, my skin prickling with anticipation, as if expecting the air to shift again, for that thick, suffocating presence to return. But nothing happened. My gaze drifted to the corner, where I had seen the figure, the same corner now bathed in soft, harmless light. There was nothing there. Swallowing hard, I reached down and ran my hand along the floorboards. The wood was smooth, old but sturdy. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Silence. I stood up quickly, shaking off the eerie feeling crawling up my spine. Maybe I really had imagined it. Maybe my mind had taken the ghost stories and run wild. But then I noticed something. Near the base of the wall, half hidden by the floral patterns, was a tiny, jagged line. A seam. My fingers traced it, following its uneven path along the wall. It was subtle, barely visible unless you were looking for it. My breath caught as I pressed my palm against the surface and felt a slight give. There was a door here, a hidden one. I hesitated. Every rational part of me screamed to stop, to pretend I had never seen it. But my hands had already moved on their own, pressing harder, searching for a way to open it. My fingers found a small gap near the edge, and with a deep breath I pulled. The wall groaned as it shifted, dust spilling from the cracks. The seam widened, and then, with a final creak, a section of the wall swung open, revealing a narrow, pitch-black space behind it. My stomach twisted. The air that seeped from the hidden room was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something faintly metallic. I covered my nose and squinted into the darkness, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The space wasn't large, no more than a crawl space, just wide enough for a small person to slip inside. I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dust, illuminating a short tunnel that stretched into the unknown. A scuttling noise echoed from the depths. I froze, the light trembling in my grip. Something was in there. A shadow shifted just beyond the reach of the beam. My breath caught, and for a second I thought I saw movement, a small pale shape disappearing further into the darkness. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of a loose floorboard. My balance tipped, and I barely caught myself before falling. My phone slipped from my grasp, skidding across the floor. The tunnel swallowed the silence. Then softly, just barely above a whisper, giggling. Not from the hidden space, from behind me, a child's laughter right by my ear. Cold breath ghosted against my skin. I turned too fast, nearly tripping in my panic. My flashlight spun wildly across the room, the beam flashing across the painted children. They had moved again. Their small painted hands were now pressed against the wall, their tiny fingers reaching, no, pulling at the edges of the hidden door. They wanted it open. A sharp pain shot through my head as dizziness washed over me. My vision blurred. and for a terrifying moment I thought I was going to pass out. The giggling grew louder, echoing inside my skull. I needed to get out. My hands scrambled for my phone, my fingers finally closing around it. I didn't even check to see if the hidden door was still open. I bolted from the room, slamming the storage door shut behind me. My breaths came in ragged gasps. I pressed my forehead against the wall, trying to steady myself. I had to tell someone. I had to do something. But as I stood there, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, a single horrifying thought settled into my mind. The children weren't just painted on the walls. They were in them, and they wanted out. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind against the windows, sent my pulse racing. My mind replayed what I had seen over and over. The shifting paintings, the hidden door, the shadow in the crawl space. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that my exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But the weight in my chest told me otherwise. They were in the walls, and they wanted out. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. My breath caught in my throat. I lay frozen in bed, my blankets pulled to my chin, barely daring to breathe. The darkness outside my window told me it was still deep into the night. The hallway beyond my door was black, nothing but a yawning void stretching toward the storage room. Then the sound of bare feet, soft, slow steps. The giggling followed, quiet and playful. My muscles locked. I didn't dare move, didn't dare even blink. The sound of feet padded closer, stopping just beside my bed. The air turned freezing. A faint wave pressed down against the mattress, like something had climbed in beside me. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs, my chest tight with terror. A tiny cold hand brushed against my arm. I flinched violently, my body jerking away as I scrambled for the lamp on my nightstand. My fingers fumbled over the switch before the warm glow flooded the room. Empty. There was nothing there. But the covers beside me were rumpled, as if someone had just been lying there. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw the blankets aside and bolted from my room, rushing down the hall. I didn't care if I woke my parents or made my dad even angrier. I had to get out of this house. But as I reached the staircase, something stopped me. The storage room door was open. The hidden door, the one in the wall, was wide open now. And the paintings, the children were gone. My stomach dropped, nausea rolling through me. I stepped forward hesitantly, my breath shallow. The tunnel gaped before me, stretching into pitch black nothingness. My phone was in my hand, but I was afraid to use the flashlight, afraid of what I might see. A faint sound echoed from the tunnel, not laughter this time. Crying, a small, pitiful sob, the kind that clawed into your chest and made you ache. I swallowed hard. I should have run. I should have slammed the door and never looked back. Instead, I whispered, "Who's there?" The crying stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then something crawled out. It moved too fast, too jerky, its limbs bending at wrong angles. A small figure, barely the size of a child, but its skin was pale, almost translucent, its eyes wide and sunken deep into its face. It reached for me with spindly fingers, its mouth stretching too far into a smile, blackened teeth lining its gums. "Come play," it whispered. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the loose floorboard. I hit the ground hard, pain jolting up my spine. The thing lurched forward, its bony fingers grasping at my ankle. I screamed. The lights in the hallway flickered violently, the walls trembling as if the house itself was breathing. The whispers, the giggles, the lullaby, they all crashed over me at once, suffocating, unbearable. The floor beneath me shifted. No, not the floor, the walls, the house. Something was moving inside them. The children were awake. With a last desperate kick, I broke free from the thing's grasp and scrambled to my feet. I didn't stop. I ran down the stairs, past the kitchen, throwing open the front door. So hard it slammed against the wall. Cold night air hit my face as I sprinted across the yard, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I reached the barn. Only then did I turn, gasping, my entire body shaking. The house stood still and silent beneath the moonlight, the open door gaping like a mouth. Then, slowly, impossibly, it began to close. The wood groaned, the hinges screeched, and the door sealed shut. The house exhaled, and the lights inside went out. By the time my parents found me the next morning, curled up in the barn, my voice was hoarse from screaming. I tried to explain what had happened, but my dad didn't believe me. He thought I had lost it, that my punishment had gotten into my head too much. But my mom, she looked at me differently, like she knew something but wouldn't say it. We moved out a week later. My dad said it was because the house was too much work, too much of a hassle, but I knew the truth. He had seen the messes, the footprints in the dust, the whispers in the night. He just refused to acknowledge them. I didn't argue. I never told anyone what really happened. Not about the tunnel, not about the missing children, not about the thing that had crawled out of the walls. But sometimes late at night, I hear them again. The laughter, the lullaby, and I know the house is still waiting for someone new to play with. I arrived in Taipei late in the evening, the city wrapped in neon and humidity. The air smelled of rain and gasoline, and the taxi driver barely spoke as he dropped me in front of my hotel, a narrow gray building pressed between two convenience stores. It wasn't much to look at, but I was traveling on a budget. Inside, the lobby was empty. A single ceiling fan creaked overhead. The receptionist, a woman in a dull uniform, barely glanced up as I approached the desk. "Room 66, 6th floor," she said, handing me the key. I hesitated. The number sent a faint chill through me. Asterisk, asterisk. Room 666 dot asterisk, asterisk. I shook it off. Superstition was pointless, and I was exhausted. The elevator groaned as it carried me upward, the dim light flickering above my head. The doors slid open onto a silent, narrow corridor, lined with identical doors. The air smelled stale, like old carpet and forgotten memories. My room was at the far end. The key turned stiffly in the lock. The door creaked open. Inside, the room was basic. Bed, desk, TV, a single window that overlooked the alley below. The wallpaper peeled at the edges. I dumped my bag on the bed and exhaled. Then came the knock. Soft 3 taps. I frowned and opened the door. Nothing. The hallway stretched out empty before me. The air felt heavier now, pressing against my skin. I peered left, then right. No one. A prank? Maybe another guest? I closed the door, shaking my head. "You're just tired, asterisk, asterisk." As I turned back to my suitcase, it happened again. Knock, 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 louder this time. A pulse of unease ran through me. My hand trembled slightly as I gripped the doorknob and pulled it open. She stood there barefoot, her red bathrobe cinched tightly at the waist. Dark hair clung to her damp face, and her eyes, wide, desperate, glittered in the dim light. She was crying, silent tears streaming down pale cheeks. I locked myself out," she whispered. My mouth was dry. Something about her made my skin crawl, but I couldn't ignore her distress. "I can get a key from the front desk," I offered. She nodded, her lip trembling. "Thank you. My husband, we fought. I don't know what to do anymore." Her voice cracked. She looked so lost. I nodded and stepped past her, hurrying to the elevator. As I pressed the button, I stole a glance back. She hadn't moved. She stood in front of my door, staring at the floor. The ride down felt longer than before. The lobby was empty again, the silence unsettling. I rang the bell on the desk. A long pause, then footsteps. The receptionist emerged from a back room, adjusting her collar. "Yes? There's a woman on my floor. She locked herself out. Can you get her a key?" The woman frowned. "What woman?" My stomach clenched. "The woman in the red robe. She knocked on my door." The receptionist's face remained blank. Then she sighed. "We have only one guest on the 6th floor tonight." My breath caught. "But She leaned forward slightly, voice dropping. "You may not believe this, but a few years ago, a woman stayed in your room. The air in my lungs turned to ice. She had a husband. They split up. She lost her mind. One night, she put on a white robe and picked up a shotgun." I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering. "She killed everyone she could." By the time they stopped her, there was so much blood that her robe wasn't white anymore. She smiled thinly. It was red. My skin prickled. My mind raced back to the woman upstairs, her damp hair, her trembling hands, the way she hadn't moved when I left. The receptionist stepped out from behind the desk. "See?" she murmured, pointing at her stomach. There, beneath her uniform, was a dark red stain. I couldn't scream, I couldn't move. The air around me turned suffocatingly still. And then, somewhere far above me, I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. I backed away from the desk, my breath shallow, my limbs cold and useless. The receptionist's smile didn't fade. She simply stood there, watching me, her hand still resting lightly over the stain on her uniform. The air between us felt thick, suffocating. "You look pale," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Do you need to sit down?" I shook my head, a feeble, jerky movement. My mind struggled to process her words, to reject the impossible. A woman who had died years ago had knocked on my door, had stood before me, crying, shaking, had spoken to me. "No," I whispered. "No, that's not—" The elevator bell chimed. My head snapped toward the sound. The doors slid open, revealing nothing but an empty, yawning blackness. The dim yellow light from the lobby barely penetrated the darkness inside. It felt wrong, deeper than it should have been, as if the space within stretched beyond the building's walls. I turned back to the receptionist, hoping for reassurance, some kind of explanation that would make sense, but she was gone. The desk was empty, the lobby silent. A cold dread wrapped around my spine. I wasn't alone here. Something was watching me. The elevator doors began to close. A flicker of movement, a shape, a figure inside. I couldn't breathe. A pair of eyes gleamed from the darkness, wide and unblinking. The woman in the red robe. The doors slid shut. I stumbled backward, my chest tightening, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. I needed to get out, run, but my legs felt frozen, my body disconnected from my will. Then the knocking started again, not from my room. From the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my feet. Light taps at first, scattered and distant, then faster, harder, until the entire hotel seemed to vibrate with the sound. A relentless echoing rhythm that swallowed my breath, my thoughts, my ability to think. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to move, to put as much distance as possible between me and that sound. My feet pounded against the carpeted floor, past empty chairs, past dark hallways that led nowhere. Then I saw the stairs. I lunged for them, nearly tripping in my desperation. My hands fumbled against the railing as I took the steps two at a time. My only thought to reach my room, to grab my things, to get out of this place before... I stopped. The air changed. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long. More doors than before, more turns that I didn't remember. The walls seemed taller, closing in. The lighting dimmed, flickering erratically. Room 66 was nowhere to be seen. I turned, heart hammering, and gasped. There she was, standing at the other end of the hallway, her red robe pooling around her feet, her head tilted, her wet hair clinging to her face, smiling. The knocking stopped, a moment of perfect, unbearable silence. Then she moved. Not walked, not ran. She glided fast, straight toward me. I turned and ran. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, the dim yellow lights overhead flickering in and out like a dying heartbeat. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I reached a turn and threw myself around it, my shoulders slamming into the wall. Pain flared, but I barely noticed. Behind me, I heard the soft whisper of movement. Not footsteps, just a shifting, sliding sound, like fabric dragging across the floor. She was still coming. I pushed forward, my fingers grazing against door handles as I passed, desperate for one that would open. Each one I tried was locked. I didn't dare look back. I could feel her presence pressing closer, the air behind me thick and humming with something unnatural. Then, an open door. I stumbled inside and shoved it shut, my shaking hands fumbling for the lock. The bolt slid into place with a dull click. Silence. I backed away from the door, my pulse hammering so hard it felt like my ribs would crack. The room was small, unfamiliar, not my own. The furniture was covered in white sheets, the air stale with dust. An unused room, a dead room. The only light came from the window, a weak glow that barely reached the corners. My eyes darted around, searching for something, anything that could help me. My phone was in my bag, back in my room. My heart clenched at the thought of going back out there. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. My breath hitched. I pressed myself against the far wall. Hands clenched at my sides. The lock rattled. The knob twisted again, harder this time. The sound scraped against my nerves. I forced myself to breathe. She couldn't get in. The door was locked. The rattling stopped. I swallowed hard. Maybe she had given up. Maybe she was gone. Then came the knock. Soft at first. A single deliberate tap. Then again, louder. And then, from the window, I turned so fast I nearly tripped. The glass reflected only darkness, but I could feel her there, just beyond the thin barrier. Watching. Waiting. The knocking came again, this time from the closet behind me. I spun around, my stomach twisting into a knot. There was no way anyone could be in there. The room had been silent when I entered. I hadn't heard movement, no sound of breathing, other than my own. But the knocking persisted, slow, steady, relentless. I couldn't stay here. I had to move. My fingers tightened into fists as I forced my legs to step forward. The air in the room had changed, heavy with the scent of something metallic. Blood. I reached for the door handle, my palms slick with sweat. The knocking stopped the second my fingers touched the metal. The silence was worse. I turned the lock and yanked the door open, my body tense to run, but the hallway was gone, beyond the dew. Ours was another room, identical to the one I was standing in. Sheets covering furniture, a single window, a closet. And inside, standing perfectly still, was the woman in the red robe. She smiled. The door slammed shut behind me. I staggered backward, my breath a choked gasp in my throat. The woman in the red robe stood across the room, her body impossibly still, her face hidden behind strands of damp, clinging hair. The dim light barely reached her, but I could see her lips stretching into that terrible, knowing smile. I lunged for the door behind me, my fingers scrabbling at the handle. Locked. I twisted, yanked, slammed my shoulder against it, but it wouldn't budge. My pulse pounded against my ribs like a trapped animal. She didn't move, but the room did. The walls trembled, the wallpaper peeling in slow curls, revealing something darker beneath, something wet, pulsing like living flesh. A low, distant sound rose around me, like whispers layered over each other, voices speaking words I couldn't understand. I pressed myself against the door, my chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. She was still there, still watching. Then finally, she moved, not walked, not stepped, just a flicker of motion, a blur, and suddenly she was closer, halfway across the room now, her bare feet pressing into the old carpet. Her hands, pale and stiff, hung motionless at her sides. I whimpered before I could stop myself. Another flicker, closer, the smell of damp fabric and old blood filled the air. I shook my head, pressing my back harder against the door, as if I could sink into it, escape through the cracks. "Please," I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice over the humming in my ears. She cocked her head, her eyes gleaming from beneath her hair. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Just a slow, wet, gurgling sound, like someone trying to breathe through a throat full of water. I shut my eyes. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The whispers grew louder. I forced my eyes open just in time to see her face inches from mine. Cold fingers clamped around my wrist. I screamed. My body jerked as if something yanked me downward, a crushing force dragging me through the floor itself. The room warped, twisted, walls stretching and bending as I fell. The last thing I saw was her face too close, her mouth opening wider, wider, until it was nothing but darkness swallowing me whole. And then, silence. I gasped, my lungs heaving as I jolted awake. I was lying on my bed in room 66. The sheets were damp with sweat. The room looked the same as before, the walls intact, the furniture untouched. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind reeled, struggling to separate dream from reality. Then I heard it, a soft knock at the door. I turned my head, my body locking up with cold terror. 3 taps, slow, measured. I stayed frozen. Then, from under my bed, a whisper. "Let me in." I couldn't breathe. My body was locked in place, every muscle tense and rigid as the whisper slithered through the silence. The air in the room had changed, thick and stagnant, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. The knock at the door came again. 3 slow, deliberate taps. But I couldn't move. I couldn't answer, because the whisper had come from under the bed. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. My fingers clenched the sheets as I forced myself to sit up, every movement feeling like it took an eternity. I didn't dare look down. My bare feet hovered inches above the floor. And I knew without a doubt, that if I let them touch the ground, something would grab me. The knock came a 3rd time, and this time, the handle of the door rattled. I sucked in a breath. Maybe this was still a dream. Maybe I had never woken up. My mind scrambled for something, anything rational. But the weight of the room, the way my skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, told me otherwise. The whisper from beneath the bed came again, softer now, coaxing. "Let me in." A chill rolled up my spine and my breath hitched. I couldn't stay here. I had to move to get out. My eyes flicked toward the door. It was only a few feet away, but the space between me and it felt impossibly vast. Slowly, carefully, I shifted my legs. If I could just get to my bag, my phone. A hand shot out from under the bed, pale, thin, fingers too long, stretching unnaturally toward my ankle. I screamed and threw myself backward, scrambling across the bed, my heart slamming against my ribs. The hand retreated, vanishing into the darkness beneath the mattress. But I had made a mistake. I had moved. The bed groaned, the air shifting, and then from the shadows she rose. Not from the door, not from the hallway, from under the bed. First, the red fabric of her robe pooled onto the floor. Then her face emerged, hair hanging limp and wet around her shoulders. Her mouth was still open, too wide, her blackened lips stretching over teeth that looked broken, shattered. Her body unfolded, slow and unnatural, as if she had no bones, no weight. She was standing now, between me and the door. A choked sound escaped my throat as I pressed myself against the headboard. Her head tilted again, that terrible knowing smile spreading wider. "You let me in," she whispered. The lights flickered once, then the room was plunged into darkness. The air turned cold, and I felt it, her breath against my cheek. I tried to scream, but the sound never came. The hotel staff found my room empty the next morning. My bag was still there, my passport, my clothes, everything untouched. The sheets were pulled back, as if I had simply gotten up and walked away. But I didn't. Somewhere in that endless stretch of hallways and doors that don't lead where they should, I am still running, still searching for an escape that does not exist. And at night, when the world is quiet, if you listen closely, you might hear the knock. Another pint should put just the right color on the day. I half whispered the thought to myself as the barman slid my drink across the worn wooden counter. The pub smelled of ale, damp wood, and the lingering bite of pipe smoke. The kind of place where time seemed to gather dust in the corners, where voices slurred together into a hum of weary contentment. I took a slow sip, the dark liquid settling warm in my stomach. It had been a long day of negotiations, of examining wool samples and nodding along to men with thick Gloucestershire accents. Stroud's wool was the finest in the world, and if I played my cards right, I'd be walking away with a deal that would make my employers back in the States very happy. I should have been thinking about that, but my attention had snagged elsewhere. A man had slunk past my stool, his ragged coat brushing against my sleeve. He was a wreck of a thing, sallow skin, stringy hair, the kind of face that looked like it had seen too many winters and too few meals. He leaned over the bar rail, his fingers tapping absently against the surface. I was prepared for the usual slurred request for spare change or a drink. But when he spoke, His voice was clear, crisp. Pint of bitter. No wavering, no drunken stumble over the words. That was the first thing that unsettled me. The second was the way he turned to look at me after taking his first long sip, his bloodshot eyes locking onto mine before I could look away. "You're not from around here." It wasn't a question. I forced a polite smile. "Just here on business." "What kind of business?" I exhaled slowly, already regretting the conversation. "Textiles," I said, lifting the edge of my scarf between two fingers. "American woolen industry. Stroud's wool is the best, or so I'm told." The man made a sound. Half laugh, half grunt. He shook his head, eyes narrowing. "So you're just another mindless sot here to castrate a ram, eh?" The comment caught me off guard. I let out a small, startled laugh. "I suppose you could put it that way." He turned away, staring into his drink. His fingers curled around the glass like they wanted to break it. "It doesn't matter anymore," he muttered. "Nothing does. Nobody's going to lift a finger to stop it." "Stop what?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on something I couldn't see, something far away. "We're all walking dead men now," he said. "All dead." I should have laughed it off, should have finished my drink and left it at that. But there was something in his voice, something hollow, something that curled into the base of my spine and stayed there. "Go on," I said. His head snapped toward me, his lips parting slightly, as if he hadn't expected me to ask. A long silence stretched between us. Then he leaned in. "Buy me a pint," he said, "and I'll tell you a story." I hesitated, but then I signaled the barman. A ghost story for a drink. Why not? The man cradled his glass as if it were something precious. He took his time, swallowing deep, letting the taste linger before speaking again. "The dead don't rest easy in Stroud," he began. "They never have." I shifted in my seat, the weight of his words settling into me. "The graveyard down the road, it holds all kinds," he continued. "Politicians, businessmen, workhouse paupers, the ones who died with their pockets full, and the ones who starved with nothing. But the paupers, they don't get marked graves. They're stacked in a shed, 10 at a time, waiting to be dumped into the earth like spoiled meat. Nobody keeps track of where they go." His fingers tightened around his glass. "The first to go into that ground was a man of no means back in 1856. They didn't mark his grave. And since then, we've lost track of them all. They don't belong anywhere. And when the dead don't belong, they don't stay buried." A chill crawled over me. I told myself it was just the drink, just the way his voice had dipped lower, the way the candlelight flickered against his face. But still, he took another deep sip. "Politics and bad blood," he murmured. "That's what runs through this town." I leaned in slightly, drawn in despite myself. "There was a man," he continued, "a good man. Henry Somerton stood up for this town in Parliament, fought for it. But another man, John Loring, wanted his seat, and Loring wasn't the kind to wait his turn." I felt the room shift slightly. Something about that name, Loring, it scratched at the edges of my mind. "The debates got nasty," the man went on. "The town turned against Somerton, spit on him, ignored him, and then one day he was dead." A pause. I swallowed. "How?" "Nobody knows." Another long sip. The coroner didn't say much. The mortician didn't bother with a proper service. They stacked him with the paupers. A knot twisted in my stomach. "Loring took his seat," he said, "and Somerton was forgotten." He lifted his glass slightly, letting the candlelight catch the liquid inside. "But you see, American, the dead don't stay forgotten. Not here." The barman passed, and I caught him throwing an uneasy glance toward the man. As if he didn't quite like that he was talking, as if the words themselves were dangerous. I turned back. The man was staring at my scarf. His fingers twitched. "You need to leave," he said. His voice had changed. There was something sharp in it now, something urgent. "Go back to America," he murmured. "Get on your airship and leave." The hairs on my arms stood on end. How do you know I have an airship? His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. And then slowly he turned his gaze toward the far end of the pub. You see that man? He said. My eyes followed his. A man in a dark wool sweater sat at the table beneath the dartboard, nursing a drink. Watch him, the old man whispered. The man in the sweater stiffened. His hand shot to his chest, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He lurched to his feet, knocking his chair over. His legs twisted unnaturally beneath him. His ribs buckled inward with a sickening crunch. His throat bulged. His face turned red, then purple. Then his eyes exploded. A spray of blood and fluid hit the table. His body convulsed, shaking violently. The sweater around his torso grew tighter and tighter until his frame collapsed inward, folding like paper until he was nothing more than a twisted, crushed shell of what had been a man. Silence. The pub was frozen in horror. And then slowly the old man turned back to me. His voice was a whisper, but it cut through the room like a knife. May I have your scarf now, American? I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The pub had fallen into a terrible silence, a silence thick with the scent of blood, and something worse, something rotten, something old. The man in the dark wool sweater lay crumpled, his insides now his outsides. His body twisted into an impossible shape. His ribs had folded in, his throat crushed, his face unrecognizable beneath the wet gleam of torn flesh and burst vessels. His wool sweater, once snug, now looked shrunken, as if it had tightened until the life was squeezed out of him. And the old man, the beggar, the derelict, the one I had foolishly shared a drink with, was watching me. His eyes were wrong, too wide, too bright, as if something else was peering through them, something patient, something hungry. May I have your scarf now, American? He asked again, his voice a slow curl of breath, almost polite, as though he were merely asking for a spare coin. I swallowed hard. The room around me seemed frozen, the air thick as tar. The other patrons, those who hadn't run from the sight of the collapsed man, sat rigid in their chairs, some with hands clamped over their mouths, others with their fingers gripping the edges of their tables as if afraid to move. I pulled at the scarf around my neck, suddenly feeling as though it were too tight. The fine wool was soft between my fingers, the kind of fabric that costs good money. I had picked it up just that morning, a gift to myself for securing the best wool contract I'd ever negotiated. Stroud wool, the finest in the world. Take it off, the old man said. His voice had lost its earlier roughness. It was smooth now, commanding, a voice that expected obedience. I hesitated, the scarf half loosened, my fingers trembling. Why? I managed to whisper. He tilted his head slightly, as though considering the question. Then his lips twisted into something that might have been a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. You know why? A cold weight settled in my stomach. I glanced down at the twisted remains of the man in the sweater, at the fabric clinging to his shattered body, and something inside me screamed. Not just the horror of his death, not just the impossibility of it, but the fact that his sweater, despite everything, still looked new, pristine, the wool unstained, as if it had drunk the blood rather than absorbed it. I wrenched the scarf from my neck and threw it at the old man. It landed in his lap like a dead thing. His fingers closed over it slowly, almost reverently. He lifted it to his face, inhaling deeply, his eyelids fluttering shut. And then, without a word, he stood and walked toward the door. The pub was silent as he left, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft creak. The moment he was gone, the air seemed to rush back into the room, as if we had all been holding our breath at once. A chair scraped against the floor, a glass shattered, and then finally someone screamed. I bolted from my seat, shoving past stunned patrons, my legs moving before my mind could see a stomach. Loring took his seat, he said, and Somerton was forgotten. He lifted his glass slightly, letting the candlelight catch the liquid inside. But you see, American, the dead don't stay forgotten, not here. The barman passed, and I caught him throwing an uneasy glance toward the man. As if he didn't quite like that he was talking, as if the words themselves were dangerous. I turned back. The man was staring at my scarf. His fingers twitched. "You need to leave," he said. His voice had changed. There was something sharp in it now, something urgent. "Go back to America," he murmured. "Get on your airship and leave." The hairs on my arms stood on end. "How do you know I have an airship?" His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. And then slowly he turned his gaze toward the far end of the pub. "You see that man?" he said. My eyes followed his. A man in a dark wool sweater sat at the table beneath the dartboard, nursing a drink. "Watch him," the old man whispered. The man in the sweater stiffened. His hand shot to his chest, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He lurched to his feet, knocking his chair over. His legs twisted unnaturally beneath him. His ribs buckled inward with a sickening crunch. His throat bulged. His face turned red, then purple. Then his eyes exploded. A spray of blood and fluid hit the table. His body convulsed, shaking violently. The sweater around his torso grew tighter and tighter until his frame collapsed inward, folding like paper, until he was nothing more than a twisted, crushed shell of what had been a man. Silence. The pub was frozen in horror. And then slowly, the old man turned back to me. His voice was a whisper, but it cut through the room like a knife. "May I have your scarf now, American?" I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The pub had fallen into a terrible silence, a silence thick with the scent of blood, and something worse, something rotten, something old. The man in the dark wool sweater lay crumpled, his insides now his outsides, his body twisted into an impossible shape. His ribs had folded in, his throat crushed, his face unrecognizable beneath the wet gleam of torn flesh and burst vessels. His wool sweater, once snug, now looked shrunken, as if it had tightened until the life was squeezed out of him. And the old man, the beggar, the derelict, the one I had foolishly shared a drink with, was watching me. His eyes were wrong, too wide, too bright, as if something else was peering through them, something patient, something hungry. "May I have your scarf now, American?" he asked again, his voice a slow curl of breath, almost polite, as though he were merely asking for a spare coin. I swallowed hard. The room around me seemed frozen, the air thick as tar. The other patrons, those who hadn't run from the sight of the collapsed man, sat rigid in their chairs, some with hands clamped over their mouths, others with their fingers gripping the edges of their tables, as if afraid to move. I pulled at the scarf around my neck, suddenly feeling as though it were too tight. The fine wool was soft between my fingers, the kind of fabric that costs good money. I'd picked it up just that morning, a gift to myself for securing the best wool contract I'd ever negotiated. Stroud wool, the finest in the world. "Take it off," the old man said. His voice had lost its earlier roughness. It was smooth now, commanding, a voice that expected obedience. I hesitated, the scarf half loosened, my fingers trembling. "Why?" I managed to whisper. He tilted his head slightly, as though considering the question. Then his lips twisted into something that might have been a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You know why?" A cold weight settled in my stomach. I glanced down at the twisted remains of the man in the sweater, at the fabric clinging to his shattered body, and something inside me screamed. Not just the horror of his death, not just the impossibility of it, but the fact that his sweater, despite everything, still looked new, pristine, the wool unstained, as if it had drunk the blood rather than absorbed it. I wrenched the scarf from my neck and threw it at the old man. It landed in his lap like a dead thing. His fingers closed over it slowly, almost reverently. He lifted it to his face, inhaling deeply, his eyelids fluttering shut. And then, without a word, he stood and walked toward the door. The pub was silent as he left, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft creak. The moment he was gone, the air seemed to rush back into the room, as if we had all been holding our breath at once. A chair scraped against the floor, a glass shattered, and then finally someone screamed. I bolted from my seat, shoving past stunned patrons, my legs moving before my mind could set a weaved past him, stumbling onto the deck. "Close it!" I gasped. "Close the damn door!" He hesitated, confused. But then he saw them, the sheep, pouring out from the darkness, swarming the field, their bodies moving in unnatural unison, their red eyes burning. The crewman cursed, lunging for the control lever. The gangway hissed as it began to retract, the door mechanism groaning into motion. The first of the sheep reached the platform, just as it began to rise. For a split second, I saw its face up close. And I knew then, without a doubt, that these were not sheep. Not anymore. Its mouth was wrong, too wide, teeth too sharp, too many. And its eyes weren't just red. They were filled with something else, something human. Something that had been waiting a long, long time. The doors sealed shut. The engines rumbled to life. And as the airship lifted into the sky, I watched through the porthole as the sheep stood below, staring up at me, their bodies still and silent once more. The old man stood among them. He smiled, and then he raised a single hand, a gesture, a farewell, or a promise. I stayed by the porthole long after the town of Stroud shrank into nothing but a smudge on the landscape below. My breath still came in ragged bursts, my heart beat a frantic drum against my ribs. The old man's face was burned into my mind, that awful smile, the way he had raised his hand like a farewell or a warning. The sheep, the impossible, nightmarish things they had become. I should have felt safe up here. The dirigible was already climbing high above the countryside, the vast empty sky stretching out in every direction. But I didn't feel safe, not at all. I turned away from the porthole, pressing my back against the wall. My fingers were still trembling. The other passengers sat in clusters across the main cabin, murmuring quietly, reading, sipping at their drinks, unaware that I had nearly been torn apart by things that should not exist. I had to calm down, had to pull myself together. A steward passed by, offering tea, and I accepted without thinking, my hands curling around the warm ceramic. I took a sip, willing the heat to steady me. It didn't. I kept seeing the man in the sweater, the way his body had collapsed inward, how the wool had tightened, suffocating, strangling, crushing. And the scarf. My scarf. I reached for my neck instinctively, feeling the empty space where it had been. The old man had taken it. A fresh chill slid down my spine. I had given it to him, had let him walk away with it, let him carry it like some kind of twisted trophy. What had he wanted it for? What would he do with it? I forced my mind away from the question. It didn't matter now. He was gone. The sheep were gone. I was on my way home. Hours passed. The dirigible floated steady through the clouds. The hum of its engines, a low, soothing presence beneath my feet. Passengers shifted in their seats, stretching, settling in for the long journey. A few were already dozing off. The calm should have settled me, but the unease wouldn't leave. I glanced around the cabin, trying to distract myself, trying to focus on something mundane. My gaze landed on the pilots, visible through the open doorway leading to the bridge. They stood at the controls, speaking quietly to one another. One of them leaned back, stretching, rolling his shoulders. And that was when I saw it. The scarf. A fine wool scarf wrapped snugly around his neck. Its fabric soft, pristine, familiar, too familiar. My stomach turned. My hands clenched around my teacup. No, it wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But then he shifted slightly, adjusting the knot at his throat, and I saw the small, frayed edge, the loose thread I had never gotten around to trimming. It was mine, the scarf I had given to the old man, the scarf that should have been far below, in the streets of Stroud, draped over the shoulders of something that wasn't human anymore. But it was here, wrapped around the pilot's neck. And then he reached up and scratched at his throat, just a small movement, absent-minded, as if something was irritating him. The air in the cabin felt suddenly too thick. He scratched again, this time tugging at the scarf, frowning slightly. His co-pilot turned to say something, but he waved him off. I set my cup down, rising slowly from my seat. Something was wrong. The pilot rolled his shoulders again, his mouth pressing into a thin line. His fingers twitched, clenching and unclenching. His breath came a little too fast. I took a step forward. His head snapped toward me. For a fraction of a second, his eyes met mine, and I knew it was already too late. A strangled sound tore from his throat. He stumbled back, grabbing at the scarf, his fingers digging into the wool, trying to pull it away. His co-pilot shouted his name, reaching for him, but the pilot lurched, his entire body convulsing. The scarf tightened. The veins in his neck bulged, his face darkening to a sickly red. His chest heaved as he fought for breath, but the wool only constricted further, twisting, shrinking, pulling. His ribs groaned. Then, with a sharp, wet crunch, they caved in. Screams filled the cabin. Passengers leapt from their seats, knocking over tables, trays, cups of tea spilling across the floor. The co-pilot grabbed the pilot's arms, trying to tear the scarf loose, but it was useless. The fabric moved on its own, winding tighter and tighter, crushing, breaking, consuming. And then, just like before, his eyes burst. A spray of blood, his body shuddering violently. And then nothing. The scarf had done its work. The pilot collapsed to the floor, his limbs twitching once, twice, then still. The co-pilot stumbled backward, his hands shaking, his face frozen in horror. His lips moved, forming silent words, words he couldn't bring himself to say. And then slowly his gaze lifted to me. A terrible hush fell over the cabin. Every eye turned toward me. I could feel it. The unspoken accusation, the silent question. What have you done? I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The co-pilot staggered to his feet, his chest heaving. His eyes darted toward the controls, the instruments flashing red, alarms beginning to blare. We were falling. The ship was tilting. The engine screamed. Chaos erupted. People shouted, scrambled for the exits, for anything to hold on to. The co-pilot fought to regain control, his hands flying over the dials, the levers. But I already knew it wouldn't matter. The wool had found its way here. It had followed me, and it wasn't finished yet. The dirigible lurched violently, sending passengers tumbling over seats, crashing into walls, shrieking as luggage rained down from overhead compartments. The floor beneath my feet tilted sharply. My stomach flipped. My hands shot out, grasping for something, anything to steady myself. The airship was falling. The co-pilot was shouting orders, his voice barely audible over the wailing alarms and the deafening roar of the wind tearing past the windows. His fingers clawed at the controls, trying desperately to level the ship. But the damn scarf still clung to the dead pilot's throat, its fibers tightening even now, as though feeding, drinking, consuming. The wool was cursed. It had to be. It had taken the man in the sweater. It had taken the pilot. And now it had found its way here into the sky, into the only place where no one could escape. The ship trembled violently. A seam in the ceiling cracked open with a shriek of metal. An icy wind howled through the cabin. Someone screamed as they lost their grip, sliding backward, their fingers scrabbling against the floor before they were sucked into the gaping wound in the airship's hull. I couldn't breathe. I turned, my eyes darting frantically, searching for anything that could stop this. The scarf. If I could get rid of it, maybe. My gaze snapped back to the dead pilot. The scarf wasn't there anymore. The realization sent a fresh wave of terror through me. My head whipped around wildly, scanning the chaos, searching, dreading. And then I saw it. The wool was moving. Not just one scarf now, not just one cursed fragment. It was spreading. Threads unraveled from sweaters, from coats, from socks and scarves and gloves. The fibers twisted, crawling, slithering along the floor, creeping up legs and arms, coiling around throats like living things. Passengers shrieked, clawing at themselves as their own clothing betrayed them. Tightening, constricting, some stumbled, collapsing, choking as the wool wove itself tighter and tighter, pulling flesh inward, crushing bones. The co-pilot's horrified gaze locked onto mine. He reached for me, a plea in his eyes, but before he could speak, his own uniform betrayed him. His woolen cuffs climbed his arms, winding around his neck, strangling the words before they could escape his lips. His body convulsed once, then his eyes exploded. I turned and ran. The dirigible was splitting apart, metal groaning as the pressure inside fought against the storm outside. The floor buckled beneath me. Wind screamed through the widening cracks. The weightless feeling of freefall began to press against my chest. I had seconds. I stumbled forward, my hands grasping for the emergency hatch. If I could just get outside, maybe what? Survive the fall? There was no way out, no escape. The wool had found me. It had followed me all the way from Stroud, from the grave of a forgotten man, from the blood-soaked fields where the sheep had waited. The old man's words echoed in my mind. The Dia, don't stay forgotten. I reached the hatch, fingers fumbling against the latch. My ears popped as the air pressure shifted, the cabin now a screaming tunnel of wind and chaos. I had to get out. I had to... Pain. A sharp, burning pain around my throat. My breath caught, strangled. My hands shot up instinctively, clawing, pulling. The scarf. Not my scarf. I had given that away. But another one, identical, impossibly soft, impossibly strong. It had found me. It tightened. The airship gave one final, violent shudder. Then the world flipped. For a fraction of a second, I was weightless, floating, suspended in the air, the wool crushing my throat, my lungs screaming for air. Then the dirigible tore apart. I fell. The cold wind slammed into me, stealing what little breath I had left. The night sky stretched endlessly above, the ground rushing toward me below. And in that final moment, before the darkness swallowed me whole, I saw them, the sheep, waiting, watching, and as I plummeted, the last thing I heard was the sound of their laughter. I arrived in Stoll just before sundown. The town was smaller than I expected, just a handful of houses, a general store, and a gas station that looked abandoned. It felt empty, like a place time had forgotten. The few people I did see barely looked up as I passed, their faces drawn and quiet. I'd come for the church. The stories had drawn me in, whispered through late-night conversations in obscure forms, a cursed tree, a hidden cellar, a legend of something buried beneath the ruins, a place where people disappeared. I parked my car at the edge of town and started up the hill on foot. The road narrowed into a dirt path, winding through overgrown fields. The wind moved through the tall grass, whispering against my legs like unseen hands. Then I saw it. The ruins of the church sat at the crest of the hill, bathed in the fading light, blackened wood and collapsed stone, nothing left but a skeletal frame. The ground around it was uneven, the grass growing in strange patterns, as if the land itself had been disturbed. I hesitated. A deep sense of unease crept up my spine. The air here felt wrong, heavier, but I had come too far to turn back. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows as I stepped through the ruins. The earth was soft beneath my feet, damp despite the dry air. I searched for the cellar doors, running my hands over the ground, pushing aside patches of grass. The wind picked up, whistling through the broken beams above me. Then my fingers brushed against something solid, wood. My pulse quickened. I cleared away the dirt, revealing old weathered doors, barely holding together. The handles were rusted, splintering beneath my grip. I hesitated again. The stories said the cellar was a place of death, a place where people vanished. I told myself it was just folklore, just a story. With a deep breath, I pulled the doors open. The smell hit me first. Earthy, stale, laced with something metallic. The darkness beyond the entrance felt absolute, swallowing the last traces of daylight. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands slick with sweat, and pointed the beam downward. Stone steps, leading into the black. Something deep inside me whispered that this was a mistake, that I should close the doors and walk away. But I couldn't. I started down. The air grew colder with each step. The walls were damp, rough stone covered in patches of moss. My footsteps echoed, swallowed by the silence. The beam of my flashlight flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. Then I heard it, a sound so faint I almost missed it. A cry, high-pitched, weak, like a baby. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The sound faded, stretching the silence thin. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Then a whisper, close, right behind me. 3 weeks. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my grip. Nothing, just darkness. The door at the top of the stairs was still open, but the light from above looked dimmer, farther away than it should have been. The air pressed around me, thick with something unseen. I should go back. I should leave. But then the crying started again, and I kept going. The crying grew louder as I descended, echoing off the stone walls, distorting in the darkness. It wasn't steady. It wavered, like something struggling for breath, like something that had been crying for a very, very long time. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep moving. My flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering, as if the batteries were failing. I tapped it, muttering under my breath, but the light remained weak. It barely reached the bottom of the stairs, revealing only the rough outline of the cellar floor. Dirt and stone, the scent of rot, the walls closed in, the space smaller than I expected. My breath came shallow as I swung the flashlight around, searching. Shapes emerged from the dark. Old wooden crates, piles of bones too small to be human, scraps of cloth disintegrating into dust. The air was damp and heavy, clinging to my skin like wet hands. The crying stopped. The silence hit so suddenly that my breath sounded deafening. I took another step forward, the dirt soft beneath my shoes. Then something shifted, a low creak, like wood bending under pressure. I turned sharply, my flashlight barely catching movement in the corner of the cellar. A shadow pulling itself back, slipping behind a pillar of stone. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to take slow, steady breaths, but the panic rising in my chest made it impossible. My fingers clenched around the flashlight, knuckles aching. Then, in the silence, I heard the whisper again. 3 weeks, closed this time, right by my ear. I spun, the flashlight beam slashing across the darkness. Dust swirled in the air, disturbed by something unseen. My skin prickled, the sensation of being watched, pressing down on me like a weight. Then I saw them, the handprints, dozens of them, scattered across the cellar walls. Small, delicate, some smeared downward as if tiny fingers had tried to claw their way out. I backed away, my foot catching on something soft. My stomach turned as I glanced down. A bundle of cloth, half buried in the dirt. A baby's blanket, darkened with age. The crying started again, but this time it was right behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. My body locked up, my breath frozen in my throat. A hand touched my shoulder, small, cold. I ran. I didn't think, didn't breathe, just moved. My body reacting on pure terror. My feet pounded up the stone steps, slipping on damp rock. The flashlight jerked wildly in my grip, the beam flashing across the cellar as I climbed. For a split second, I saw something, a figure standing in the center of the room. A girl in a tattered white dress, hair hanging in damp strands over her face. Her hands, small, pale, were outstretched, reaching for me, and the doors above slammed shut. The darkness swallowed me whole. I slammed into the wooden doors, my palms scraping against the rough surface. The cellar was pitch black now, the weight of the dark pressing against my skin like something alive. My breath came in short, ragged bursts as I fumbled for the handle, yanking at it with shaking hands. It wouldn't budge. No. No, no, no. I braced my shoulder against the doors and shoved, but they held firm, as if something on the other side was pushing back. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else until I heard it. Soft footsteps on the stairs behind me, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I turned my head just enough to see over my shoulder. My flashlight lay on the ground where I dropped it, its weak beam flickering, barely piercing the thick air. The steps continued, uneven, as if whatever was descending wasn't used to walking. Then I saw her, the girl. She stood halfway down the stairs, her small frame draped in a white dress, torn and stained. Her face was hidden beneath tangled, damp hair, strands clinging to her hollow cheeks. Her head tilted slightly, the way a curious animal might observe something trapped. My stomach twisted. She took another step forward. A whimper clawed its way up my throat, but I swallowed it down. I pressed my back harder against the doors, my fingers searching blindly for anything I could use. A loose stone, A broken piece of wood, anything. She moved again and again, closer. The air in the cellar grew colder, the scent of damp earth thick in my lungs. My breath clouded in front of me, curling in the dim light. Then she whispered, 3 weeks. My pulse stuttered. I had heard those words before, but this time her voice wasn't empty. It was pleading, desperate. I didn't think. I lunged for the flashlight, fingers wrapping around its cold metal surface, and aimed it at her. The beam trembled, flickering as it landed on her small, fragile frame. She stopped, a sharp inhale, like someone gasping for air after being underwater too long. Then, a scream. It wasn't human. It wasn't the cry of a child. It was something else. Something ancient, raw, and filled with unending sorrow. The walls trembled. The floor beneath me seemed to shift, and suddenly the ground wasn't solid anymore. I fell, down, not backward, not forward, just down, as if the earth itself had swallowed me whole. My scream tangled with hers, and then silence. I opened my eyes to darkness. Cold seeped into my bones, the air heavy with the scent of decay. My flashlight was gone, my body sprawled on something damp and uneven. I wasn't in the cellar anymore. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. And in the distance, through the black, the crying started again. The crying echoed through the darkness, distant but growing closer, weaving through the air, like a thread being pulled tighter and tighter. I tried to move, but my limbs felt sluggish, my body sinking into the cold, damp ground beneath me. It wasn't just dirt. It was softer, like something rotting, something breathing. My breath came fast and shallow. The air was thick with a sour, metallic scent filling my nose, clinging to the back of my throat. I forced myself to sit up, my hands pressing into the wet ground. My fingers sank in slightly. I jerked them away, a shudder running through me. I couldn't see anything. The darkness was absolute. I turned my head, listening. The crying had changed. It wasn't the weak, high-pitched wail of a newborn anymore. It was layered now, voices overlapping, stretching, warping, the sound of something not quite human, trying to remember how to cry like one. Panic surged through me. I had to get out. I pushed myself to my feet, my body unsteady, my heartbeat thrumming, G in my ears. I turned in a slow circle, my hands stretched out, searching for a wall, a door, anything. But there was nothing, just endless black. Then, beneath the crying, another sound, scraping, something moving just out of reach. A shift in the air, a whisper of fabric. I wasn't alone. I swallowed hard and forced my shaking hands to stay steady. Who's there? My voice came out hoarse, barely more than a breath. The crying stopped. The silence that followed was worse, heavy, expectant. Then, a whisper, so close it sent a cold rush down my spine. You found the door. I turned sharply, my foot slipping on the wet ground. I caught myself just before falling. My breath came faster now, the darkness pressing in, shifting like something alive. Then I saw it, a shape in the black, barely visible. A figure standing still, its outline flickering in and out of focus like a bad signal. The air around it seemed distorted, wrong. I couldn't see its face, only the vague shape of a body, small, hunched, waiting. My body screamed at me to run. Then it moved, not walked, not stepped, just moved. 1 second it was a few feet away. The next it was closer. The next, closer still. The air went ice cold. My skin prickled, my legs locked up, every part of me frozen in place. The figure reached out. A hand, small and pale, fingers stretched too long. Its nails scraped against my arm, leaving a cold burn in their wake. My throat closed, then the whisper again. 3 weeks. A rush of cold flooded my chest, a weight pressing into my ribs, squeezing the air from my lungs. My vision blurred, the darkness around me folded inward, collapsing. I felt myself sinking, slipping, something pulling me down. And then, light, blinding, white. I was on the hill. The ruined church stood before me, silent and empty. The ground beneath my hands was dry, solid. My breath came in harsh, uneven gulps. The air smelled of dirt and old wood, not decay. The sun was rising. I was back, but I wasn't alone. The cellar doors were open, and from below, in the blackness, the crying began again. I scrambled to my feet, my entire body trembling. The cellar doors yawned open in front of me, the blackness inside still and waiting. The crying was softer now, almost distant, but I could hear it winding up through the cold morning air. It was calling me back. No. I took a step back, shaking my head, my breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. I was out. I had made it out. The sky above me was streaked with the pale light of dawn, the wind brushing against my skin, cool and real. I turned toward my car, my body screaming at me to move, to run, to never look back. But then I heard it. A second cry, higher, thinner, not coming from the cellar. It was coming from behind me. Slowly I turned my head. At the edge of the ruined church, standing just beyond the crumbling walls, was a figure, the girl. And she was standing completely still, her white dress swaying in the wind. Her head tilted slightly, her dark hair hanging in damp strands around her face. The morning light should have softened her, made her look less unnatural, but it didn't. Her skin was too pale, almost gray. Her bare feet barely touched the ground, and she was staring at me, a whisper of movement. The wind caught her dress, lifting it slightly. Her hands hung at her sides, small and delicate, fingers twitching. Her lips parted. "You found the door." The words sent a fresh wave of cold through me. I stepped back again, my heel catching on uneven ground. My breath was ragged now, too fast, too loud. She moved. A single step forward. I turned and ran. The path down the hill was uneven, the grass slick with morning dew. My feet slid, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't dare look back. The wind howled through the trees, whispering, shifting. The town below looked impossibly far away. A scream tore through the air. Not mine, not human. It rose behind me, stretching, splitting the morning apart. A sound of pure anguish, of something that had waited too long. I kept running, the ground leveled out, the first houses of the town appearing ahead. My car was still there, parked exactly where I had left it. The engine roared to life the second I turned the key. My hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I didn't look at the hill. I didn't need to. I knew she was still there, standing at the ruins of the church, watching me. I left Stool without looking back. The roads blurred beneath my tires, the morning light growing stronger as I drove. My breath wouldn't slow. My skin still felt too cold. I told myself I had escaped. I told myself it was over. But that night, as I lay awake in a cheap motel miles away, I heard it again. A soft cry. "See," owning from the closet. And when I finally dared to move, to reach out with a shaking hand and turn on the light, the door was open. And inside, in the dark, something whispered. 3 weeks. I never forgot about that house. I tried to, of course. My parents convinced me I had imagined it. A child's wild fantasy born from a bad dream or an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had escaped. For years, I avoided that street. I refused to go near where the house had once stood. Refused to even look in that direction when I passed by. But sometimes, late at night, I would wake up gasping for air, my skin cold with sweat. The memory of blue eyes staring into mine, seared into my mind. And the worst part? The house was gone, but I still felt it. Not every day, not even every month. But sometimes when I was walking home alone or lying in bed just before sleep took me, I get that same feeling I had the first time I saw it. The feeling of something pulling at me, wrapping around my ribs like invisible fingers. A dark presence pressing against my skin, whispering for me to come back. I told myself it wasn't real. Then, one summer afternoon, I saw her again. I had just turned 10. It was the hottest day of the year, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the pavement. I was riding my bike through the neighborhood, cutting through the back streets to get home faster. I wasn't even thinking about that asterisk street. I'd convinced myself There was nothing to be afraid of anymore. But as I turned the corner, I felt it. The air changed. It wasn't hot anymore. It was still heavy. The sun seemed dimmer somehow, the shadows stretching too long across the pavement. My stomach twisted, that same sick feeling creeping up my spine. And then I saw her, the old woman. She was standing at the edge of the sidewalk, right where the house used to be. She wore the same white dress, her silver hair pinned back neatly, her hands folded in front of her, like she was waiting for something. Waiting for asterisk. Asterisk. I skidded to a stop so fast that my tires squealed against the pavement. My breath caught in my throat. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to pedal as fast as I could in the other direction. But I couldn't move. She smiled, and then, without a sound, she lifted one hand and pointed to the empty lot behind her, to where the house had once stood. I shook my head, whispering, "No." She didn't speak. She just kept smiling, her blue eyes too bright, too wide, her finger still pointing. And then, right before my eyes, the lot changed. The dry grass shifted, the shadows stretched longer, and slowly, impossibly, the black and white brick walls of the house started to rise from the earth. The house was coming back, and I knew, somehow, that if I didn't move, it would take me with it. I turned and pedaled as hard as I could, my legs burning, my breath ragged. The air around me felt thick, heavy, like riding through water. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. The urge to glance over my shoulder gnawed at me, but something deep in my gut told me that if I did, if I so much as caught a glimpse of that house, it would be real again. Completely. And it wouldn't let me go this time. My tires hit a crack in the pavement, and I nearly lost control. My bike wobbled violently, but I forced myself to keep pedaling, keep pushing forward, until I finally reached my street. As soon as my house came into view, I jumped off my bike, letting it crash onto the driveway. I ran inside, slamming the door behind me. The house was cool, the air conditioning humming softly, but I was still drenched in sweat. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might be sick. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. Then I heard my mom's voice from the kitchen. "Back so soon?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to sound normal. "Yeah, it just got too hot." I didn't tell her what I saw. I had learned my lesson when I was 4. She wouldn't believe me. No one would. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of my fan creaking above me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, standing there, smiling, pointing. The worst part was, I could still feel it. That pull, that whisper in my bones, calling me back. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over, because the next thing I knew, I was dreaming. But it didn't feel like a dream. It felt real. I was standing in front of the house again. The black and white bricks gleamed under the moonlight. The dead trees in the yard stretched their brittle limbs toward the sky. The door was open just a crack, waiting. I didn't want to move, but my body did. One step, then another, then I was at the front door, my fingers reaching for the handle. The air around me was thick with the scent of something sweet. Cookies, freshly baked, the same smell I remembered from all those years ago. A voice, soft and warm, floated from inside. "Come in, dear. I've been waiting for you." My stomach clenched. I willed myself to stop, to turn around, to run, but my hand was already pressing against the door, already pushing it open. A wave of warmth washed over me. As I stepped inside, the living room was exactly as I remembered it. The candlelight, the evergreen trees, the soft grass beneath my feet. And there she was, the old woman, sitting in her chair, smiling, a plate of cookies resting on her lap, her blue eyes locked onto mine. "You never finished your cookie," she said. I opened my mouth to speak, to scream, but I couldn't, because when I looked down at my hands, I was holding one, a half-eaten cookie, and I had already taken a bite. The taste filled my mouth before I could react. It was warm, buttery, melting against my tongue. But something was wrong. It was too soft, too wet. A sickly sweet aftertaste coated my throat, clinging like syrup. My stomach twisted violently. I gagged, my fingers trembling as I tried to spit it out, but it was already sliding down my throat. The old woman's smile widened, deepening the wrinkles in her face, and she leaned forward in her chair, eyes glinting like glass under candlelight. "There now," she crooned. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" My body swayed. The walls around me seemed to shift, colors darkening. The once cozy glow of the candles flickering into something dimmer, colder. My vision blurred at the edges. My legs felt weak, unsteady, like they weren't entirely my own anymore. I had to get out. Now. I turned, stumbling toward the door. But the second I took a step, the floor changed. The soft grass under my feet was gone, replaced with something cold, wet. I looked down. Dirt. Dark, loose soil stretched beneath me, swallowing my footprints as quickly as I made them. My breath hitched. The walls of the house were vanishing. The warm golden glow was fading, dissolving into shadows. The house wasn't real. It never had been. This place wasn't a home. It was a grave. Something moved behind me. I turned my head just enough to see. The old woman wasn't sitting anymore. She was standing, but she wasn't moving toward me. Not exactly. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She was hovering. Her body swayed ever so slightly, as if she were suspended by invisible strings. Her head tilted, her mouth still stretched into that same pleasant smile. But something about it had changed. The corners were too sharp, too wide. And then I saw her hands. They weren't hands at all. They were long, thin, bony things, her fingers stretched into claw-like points, her nails curling like gnarled roots. She raised one hand slowly, gesturing toward me. My legs locked, my body refused to move. "Stay," she whispered, her voice curled around me, thick as smoke. "You've already eaten. You belong here now." No. I wrenched my foot free from the sinking dirt, forcing myself forward. My limbs were slow, heavy, but I pushed forward, clawing at the air, at the walls that were no longer there, at anything that could pull me back into the real world. A sharp, cold pain shot through my ankle. I looked down. A hand, small, gray, clutching my leg, a child's hand. Another one emerged from the dirt, then another, dozens of tiny fingers, grasping, pulling, rising from the grave beneath me. Their grip tightened. I screamed. The old woman's laughter slithered through the darkness, soft and knowing. The floor caved beneath me, and I fell. I plunged into the dark, swallowed by cold, damp earth. The air was gone, ripped from my lungs as I tumbled, dirt filling my mouth, my nostrils, my ears. Hands clawed at me from below, small and relentless, dragging me deeper, their grip tightening until my ribs felt like they would crack. I fought, I kicked, thrashed, tried to scream, but the soil smothered my voice. The pressure built around me, crushing, unbearable, until I wasn't falling anymore. I was still, suspended, the weight of the earth holding me in place. Then, silence. For a long moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the overwhelming sensation of being buried alive. Then, from somewhere above, a voice, soft, gentle, sickeningly sweet. "You were supposed to stay." The dirt around me shifted, loosening, and suddenly I could move again. My fingers twitched. I dug at the soil, clawing my way upward, dragging myself toward the faintest sliver of light above me. My chest burned. My mind screamed. I didn't know if I was even alive anymore. But I had to get out. The moment my hand broke through the surface, the world snapped back into place. I gasped, sucking in a sharp breath as I tore myself free. My body lurched forward, collapsing onto solid ground. Grass. Real grass. The air was cold, sharp, real. I was back on my street. I turned over, choking on dirt. My heart a wild, panicked drum in my chest. The sky above me was dark, stars scattered across it like distant eyes. The wind blew against my face, carrying the familiar scent of summer. I scrambled to my feet, shaking, disoriented. My hands were covered in soil, my clothes damp and torn. I turned to look behind me, back to where I had just crawled out from. There was nothing, No hole, no disturbed earth, just the empty lot where the house had once stood, silent and untouched. But I knew it wasn't over. The old woman's voice still echoed in my ears, a whisper curling around my thoughts, like a shadow that would never leave. You belong here now. I ran all the way home, my legs weak beneath me, my lungs burning. When I reached my house, I burst through the door, locking it behind me, my fingers trembling so hard they barely worked. My parents were asleep. The world was still normal, but I wasn't. I climbed into bed fully clothed, pulling the blankets around me, trying to convince myself I was safe, that I had escaped. Then, just as I closed my eyes, I smelled it, sweet, warm, familiar, the scent of freshly baked cookies. And from the closet, a voice, soft, patient, waiting. You never finished your cookie? I froze, my body locked up so completely that I couldn't even breathe. The scent of cookies thickened in the air, warm and buttery, laced with something sour underneath, something rotten. The voice came again, closer this time. You took a bite. You belong here now. The closet door creaked, just a little, just enough. My breath finally escaped in a shuddering gasp. My fingers gripped the blanket so tightly I thought they might break. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to throw open my bedroom door and get as far away as possible. But I didn't move. I couldn't, because I knew, deep in my bones, deep in the place where nightmares live, that if I ran, if I turned my back for even a second, she would be waiting. She would be there behind me. So I did the only thing I could. I reached under my pillow, fingers shaking, and grabbed my flashlight. Slowly, barely breathing, I raised it toward the closet. The door was open just a crack, the darkness inside thicker than it should have been. A void swallowing the weak light from my lamp. I clicked the flashlight on. A pair of blue eyes stared back at me, too wide, too bright. A smile, stretching too far. I choked on a scream, scrambling backward until my back hit the headboard. The closet door creaked open wider, not all the way, just enough for her to step forward. She didn't. She just stood there, watching, smiling. Then slowly she raised one hand. Her long, curled fingers stretched out, holding something small, something crumbling at the edges. A cookie. Finish it, she whispered. I shook my head violently. My whole body trembled, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear my own breath. Her smile didn't falter, but her fingers did. They twitched just slightly, and the cookie crumbled a little more. You took a bite, she said again. A sound drifted from the closet behind her. A rustling, a shifting, and then I saw them, small hands, tiny pale fingers, reaching from the dark. Children. Their hands clawed at the edges of the door frame, dozens of them, grasping, stretching. Their voices rose in a chorus of whispers. You took a bite, you took a bite, you took a bite. My vision blurred, my throat tightened. My body screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then I remembered, the last time I escaped, the only time. When you do brave things, that's when it really matters. With every ounce of strength left in me, I lunged forward. Not away from her, toward her, and I slammed the closet door shut. The moment it clicked into place, the room snapped back to normal. The air cleared, the scent of cookies vanished, the whispers stopped. Silence. I sat there, shaking, staring at the door. The wood looked ordinary, innocent, like any other closet door in any other house. But I knew better. I knew she was still in there, waiting. And I knew without a doubt that one day she would find a way out again, because I had taken a bite. A man is never as brave as he claims to be, not until the moment calls for it. And by then, it's usually too late. The sea was calm when we set sail, the kind of eerie stillness that makes sailors whisper of omens. The sun had yet to fully rise, casting the water in a murky shade of violet and gray. Max sat across from me in the dinghy, hands gripping the oars, his face as strong as ever. He had barely spoken a word since we left the ship. It suited me fine. Darwell Isle loomed before us like the hunchback corpse of some forgotten god. The trees swayed in slow, mournful unison. thick canopies blotting out any glimpse of what lay beyond. There was something about it, something not quite right. It was the smell, I realized. Even from the shore, I could detect the damp stench of decay beneath the salty breeze. Eager to claim your new kingdom? Mac asked dryly as the dinghy scraped against the shore. I stood, stepping onto the damp sand with a grand flourish. I claim this island in the name of Augustine Stevens. For England. The words barely left my lips before a shudder passed through the trees. A flock of black sparrows exploded from the canopy, their shrill cries slicing through the heavy air as they took flight away from the island. My crew stirred uneasily, exchanging nervous glances. Mac scoffed. You always did know how to make an entrance. I ignored him, marching forward with the confidence of a man who had never faced true danger. The jungle swallowed us whole within minutes. The deeper we ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The light faded unnaturally fast, shadows stretching long and thick between the tangled roots and ancient trunks. Strange, unrecognizable calls echoed in the distance, high-pitched wails, guttural clicking sounds that made the hair on my arms stand on end. By midday, we had set up camp near a clearing. The men, uneasy as they were, worked efficiently. A fire was built, supplies were arranged. The jungle, however, refused to be silenced. I took the first watch, sitting by the crackling fire, as the others succumbed to restless sleep. The swallows still called from the trees, but their cries were different now, strained, frantic, as though they were warning of something. And then I heard it, a scream, deep, raw, filled with agony. It came from within the jungle. My blood turned cold as a figure exploded from the undergrowth, moving too fast, too erratically. A man, no, something that had once been a man, staggered into the firelight. His face was a rictus of terror, his body twisted, contorted in ways that defied nature. His skin was torn, his arms elongated, fingers curled into claws. His mouth gaped in an endless, silent scream. Run! His voice was barely human. Before I could move, something massive crashed through the trees behind him. The firelight illuminated the thing in brief, flickering glimpses. Long, unnatural limbs, a gaping mouth where no mouth should be. It was fast, too fast. The man never had a chance. With a sickening crunch, the creature's enormous hand slammed down, crushing him into the earth like an insect. And then slowly its headless form turned toward me. The jungle fell silent, and then it lunged. I ran. My legs carried me before my mind could even register the action. The jungle closed in around me, branches slashing at my face, roots threatening to send me sprawling. Behind me, I could hear the thing, its massive, malformed limbs crashing through the undergrowth, snapping branches like twigs. It didn't move like a beast. It moved like something that had never belonged in this world to begin with. A scream ripped through the trees. One of my men, then another, blood-curdling, gurgling sounds of torn flesh and breaking bones. I wanted to turn back, to see, to help, but my instincts overpowered my pride. There was no helping them. Ahead, the jungle opened into a narrow ravine, deep and jagged, a wound in the earth. I had no time to stop. My foot caught on a tangle of roots and I was falling, air rushing past me, the ground tilting, my vision blurring. Then, impact. The pain exploded in my side. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. The world spun. I struggled to my hands and knees, blinking away the shock. The ravine walls loomed high around me, thick with vines and damp moss. And then I heard it. Not the creature, not yet. Laughter, weak at first, then growing stronger, more amused. I looked up. Mac. He stood at the edge of the ravine, rifle in hand, peering down at me with an expression I had never seen before. Satisfaction. Vindication. You sure have a way with that thing, he said, tilting the barrel toward the jungle, where the sounds of my dying men still echoed. I opened my mouth, but before I could form words, he stepped forward and gave me a gentle, almost playful nudge with his boot. A man is never as brave as he claims to be, not until the moment calls for it. And by then, it's usually too late. The sea was calm when we set sail, the kind of eerie stillness, that make sailors whisper of omens. The sun had yet to fully rise, casting the water in a murky shade of violet and gray. Max sat across from me in the dinghy, hands gripping the oars, his face as strong as ever. He had barely spoken a word since we left the ship. It suited me fine. Darwell Isle loomed before us like the hunchback corpse of some forgotten god. The trees swayed in slow, mournful unison, thick canopies blotting out any glimpse of what lay beyond. There was something about it, something not quite right. It was the smell, I realized. Even from the shore, I could detect the damp stench of decay beneath the salty breeze. "Eager to claim your new kingdom?" Mac asked dryly as the dinghy scraped against the shore. I stood, stepping onto the damp sand with a grand flourish. "I claim this island in the name of Augustine Stevens. For England." The words barely left my lips before a shudder passed through the trees. A flock of black sparrows exploded from the canopy, their shrill cries slicing through the heavy air as they took flight, away from the island. My crew stirred uneasily, exchanging nervous glances. Max scoffed. "You always did know how to make an entrance." I ignored him, marching forward with the confidence of a man who had never faced true danger. The jungle swallowed us whole within minutes. The deeper we ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The light faded unnaturally fast, shadows stretching long and thick between the tangled roots and ancient trunks. Strange, unrecognizable calls echoed in the distance, high-pitched wails, guttural, clicking sounds that made the hair on my arms stand on end. By midday, we had set up camp near a clearing. The men, uneasy as they were, worked efficiently. A fire was built, supplies were arranged. The jungle, however, refused to be silenced. I took the first watch, sitting by the crackling fire as the others succumbed to restless sleep. The swallows still called from the trees, but their cries were different now, strained, frantic, as though they were warning of something. And then I heard it, a scream, deep, raw, filled with agony. It came from within the jungle. My blood turned cold as a figure exploded from the undergrowth, moving too fast, too erratically. A man, no, something that had once been a man, staggered into the firelight. His face was a rictus of terror, his body twisted, contorted in ways that defied nature. His skin was torn, his arms elongated, fingers curled into claws. His mouth gaped in an endless, silent scream. "Run!" His voice was barely human. Before I could move, something massive crashed through the trees behind him. The firelight illuminated the thing in brief, flickering glimpses, long, unnatural limbs, a gaping mouth where no mouth should be. It was fast, too fast. The man never had a chance. With a sickening crunch, the creature's enormous hand slammed down, crushing him into the earth like an insect. And then slowly, its headless form turned toward me. The jungle fell silent, and then it lunged. I ran. My legs carried me before my mind could even register the action. The jungle closed in around me, branches slashing at my face, roots threatening to send me sprawling. Behind me, I could hear the thing, its massive, malformed limbs crashing through the undergrowth, snapping branches like twigs. It didn't move like a beast. It moved like something that had never belonged in this world to begin with. A scream ripped through the trees. One of my men, then another, blood-curdling, gurgling sounds of torn flesh and breaking bones. I wanted to turn back, to see, to help, but my instincts overpowered my pride. There was no helping them. Ahead, the jungle opened into a narrow ravine, deep and jagged, a wound in the earth. I had no time to stop. My foot caught on a tangle of roots and I was falling. Air rushing past me, the ground tilting, my vision blurring. Then impact. The pain exploded in my side. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. The world spun. I struggled to my hands and knees, blinking away the shock. The ravine walls loomed high around me, thick with vines and damp moss. And then I heard it. Not the creature, not yet. Laughter, weak at first, then growing stronger, more amused. I looked up. Mac. He stood at the edge of the ravine, rifle in hand, peering down at me, with an expression I had never seen before. Satisfaction. Vindication. "You sure have a way with that thing," he said, tilting the barrel toward the jungle, where the sounds of my dying men still echoed. I opened my mouth, but before I could form words, he stepped forward and gave me a gentle, almost playful nudge with his boot. And vehement behind me, the crunch of bone under shifting weight. I did not look back. My hands found the nearest root, slick and damp but strong. I pulled myself upward, my arms screaming in protest, my breath coming in sharp gasps. My injured leg was useless, dangling as I climbed. The sounds behind me grew louder. The beast was moving now, its weight dragging across the bodies, displacing the dead. Then a new sound, a sharp cracking noise, like splitting wood, but deeper, more organic. I didn't want to know. I climbed faster, pulling with everything I had, my fingers slipping but refusing to let go. The top of the ravine was close now. I could see the trees, the light shifting beyond them, the world outside this grave. And then the stench hit me, stronger than before, suffocating. Something warm and wet slid against my ankle. A tongue. I screamed. The grip was sudden, inhumanly strong. A force wrenched me downward, nearly tearing me from the wall. My nails scraped against the earth as I struggled, my free leg kicking wildly, blindly. The tongue coiled tighter, slick and muscular, pulling. I found a rock, a jagged, broken piece wedged in the dirt. I grabbed it without thinking and swung downward, burying it into the pulsing, grotesque flesh wrapped around my ankle. A sound erupted from the beast, high-pitched, inhuman, a screech of pure rage. The grip loosened for a fraction of a second, just enough. I tore myself free, pain searing up my leg, and lunged upward. My hands found the last root, the last ledge. With a final desperate heave, I threw myself over the edge. I landed hard, rolling onto my back, gasping, shaking. The jungle loomed above me, dark and endless. I expected the beast to follow, to rise from the pit like some nightmare reborn. But it didn't. Instead, there was silence, no movement, no screech of hunger, just the wind rustling through the leaves. I lay there, staring at the sky, trying to understand. And then I heard it, not from the ravine, from the jungle itself. The sound of something moving, many somethings. They had been watching, they had always been watching. The jungle was no longer still. The air was thick with the sound of movement, shuffling, rustling, the crack of twigs beneath unseen feet. Not one thing, not the beast from the ravine, many, surrounding me. I pushed myself upright, every muscle screaming in protest. My ankle was useless, a throbbing mass of agony, but I couldn't afford to rest. The trees loomed above, twisted shadows shifting in the dim light. Shapes moved between them, just beyond the edge of my vision. Fast, silent, I reached for my belt, for my knife. Nothing. It must have been lost in the fall. My breath came in sharp gasps, my chest tight with exhaustion and fear. I was unarmed, wounded, and alone. A whisper, not the wind, not a voice, a sound low and clicking, passing from one tree to another. I turned too quickly, nearly losing my balance, and caught a glimpse of something in the undergrowth. A figure, crouched low, its body thin, elongated, pale flesh, slick and raw, almost translucent. No eyes, just a smooth, featureless face, except for the mouth. A gaping, lipless hole lined with rows of needle-like teeth. It didn't move. Not yet. Another whisper, this time behind me. I spun again, heart hammering. Another one, pressed against a tree, motionless but watching. More shifted between the leaves, just shapes, just outlines of things that should not be. They had been here all along. A sharp chittering sound filled the air, a burst of clicks and hisses, not random. Communication. The figures shifted, heads tilting in unnatural, jerking motions. They were speaking to each other, deciding something. Then as one, they began to move. Not toward me, toward the ravine. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, as they glided forward. Dozens of them, slipping between the trees like liquid shadows, their bodies contorting unnaturally, their feet barely touching the ground. I turned my head slowly, following their path, and felt my stomach drop. The beast was climbing. Its massive limb dragged its twisted body upward, fingers sinking into the earth, pulling itself from the pit of corpses. The gaping maw in its torso gnashed open and closed. strands of saliva and blood stretching between its jagged teeth. Its headless form twisted, sensing the things in the trees. The pale creatures did not run. They did not cower. They surrounded it. The jungle pulsed with their chittering voices, an eerie, synchronized rhythm. The beast hesitated. It was powerful, fast, a nightmare given form, but it was outnumbered, and they knew it. One of the pale figures moved first. It darted forward with impossible speed, latching onto the beast's enormous arm, its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, teeth sinking into hick, rotting flesh. The beast roared. The others descended. It was not a battle. It was a feeding. They tore into it with terrifying precision, their needle-like teeth slicing through muscle and sinew as though it were nothing. The beast thrashed, tried to fight, but they swarmed it, climbing over its body like starving locusts. The maw in its torso opened wide, letting out a sound that was more than a scream, something deep, reverberating, an unnatural wail that rattled my bones. Then silence. The beast was gone. Nothing remained but the sound of chewing, of bones snapping, of wet tearing flesh. I took a step back. A single misstep. A branch cracked beneath my foot. The chittering stopped. Slowly as one, the pale creatures lifted their heads, their mouths still dripped with thick black ichor. They turned toward me, bodies still, heads tilting in unison. They had not forgotten me, and they were still hungry. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just turned and bolted into the jungle, ignoring the pain in my ankle, the branches tearing at my skin. The air was thick with the scent of blood and decay. The earth damp beneath my feet. My breath came in ragged gasps, and behind me I could hear them move, not running, gliding, their feet barely touching the ground, their bodies shifting between the trees like specters, unnatural and relentless. I crashed through the undergrowth, my mind screaming at me to keep moving, to find anything, a weapon, a hiding place, a way out. But the jungle was endless, the darkness pressing in, twisting in on itself. Every tree looked the same, every path led nowhere. I had no direction, no escape. Then I saw it, a flicker of light between the trees. Small, distant but real. The shore, the ship. Hope surged through me, burning away the exhaustion. If I could reach the beach, if I could get to the dinghy, I could make it back to the ship. I pushed forward, forcing my legs to move faster than they should have, ignoring the fire in my lungs, the searing pain in my ankle. The whispers followed, soft clicking sounds, passing through the trees, growing closer. They were playing with me, letting me think I could make it. I broke through the last line of trees, and the shore opened before me. The ship was still anchored offshore, its dark silhouette barely visible against the early morning light. The dinghy was there, waiting, bobbing gently against the sand. I stumbled forward, throwing myself toward it, shoving it into the water with what little strength I had left. My hands trembled as I climbed in, grasping the oars. The whispers stopped. I looked back. They stood at the edge of the jungle, a dozen or more, their pale, featureless faces turned toward me. They did not step onto the sand, did not cross the line where jungle met shore. They only watched, their mouths twitched slightly, almost as if smiling. I didn't wait to understand. I rode with everything I had, muscles screaming, heart pounding. The water carried me away. The island shrinking behind me. I didn't look back again. By the time I reached the ship, I was shaking. The crew pulled me aboard, voices shouting, questions firing at me. But I had no answers, no words. I collapsed onto the deck, staring at the sky, feeling the weight of what I had seen pressed down on me. Mac was gone. The others were gone. The island had swallowed them. We set sail before sunset, leaving Darwell Isle behind. The men whispered, glancing at me with wary eyes. But no one asked what had happened. Perhaps they saw it in my face. Perhaps they already knew. Days passed. I tried to forget. Then, one night, as I stood on the deck, staring at the moonlit waves, I heard it. A whisper, not from the sea, from the shadows below deck. You'll think I'm crazy, or just some idiot looking for attention. I don't care. Something happened to me. It happened. I keep telling myself I imagined it, that it was a dream, or a panic attack, or some stress-induced hallucination. That's what I have to believe. Because if it was real, if any part of it was real, then I don't know how to keep living without losing my mind. I visit my grandparents every summer. They live in an old, faded yellow apartment building in a city that is both old and new at the same time. You know the kind? Cobblestone streets where modern cars look out of place. An old world wrapped in a new one. It's beautiful. It's eerie. Their building has an elevator, one of those tiny, ancient ones with a metal door you have to pull open yourself. It has no inner doors, just a box that moves up and down the shaft with the walls exposed. You could reach out and touch them if you wanted to. I used to when I was younger. Let my fingers graze the rough concrete as I ascended. The sound of my nails scraping along the wall used to make me shudder, but I still did it. I liked the feeling of being in motion, of watching the world shift around me. I always take the elevator to my grandparents' apartment on the 8th floor. I've done it 100 times, nothing strange, nothing unusual, until 2 nights ago. I had been out later than usual. The streets were quieter, emptier. The air was thick with that summer heat that never quite goes away, even after the sun has set. I was tired, a little sweaty, and eager to get upstairs. I pressed the button for the elevator and waited. I could hear it groaning its way down from another floor. When it arrived, I pulled open the metal door and stepped inside, hit the button for the 8th floor, turned around, and then something was off. I felt it before I saw it. The elevator was moving, but too slowly. Usually I could count the floors by the way the light flickered through the cracks in the door. 1, 2, 3. Quick, rhythmic, predictable. But this time there was no rhythm. The flickers were uneven, some too long, some too short. I glanced at the little mirror someone had stuck to the wall opposite. A cheap, square thing with a red frame. I had used it countless times to check my makeup, to fix my hair. I looked at myself now, expecting to see my tired, sweaty reflection. Instead, I saw something else. The numbers were gone. The floors, gone. Just the dull, featureless blur of moving walls, shifting too fast to focus on, like staring at a static-filled TV screen. I turned away from the mirror and looked at the wall, hoping to catch a glimpse of a scrawled floor number as we passed. Nothing. No numbers, no markings, just gray, endless concrete. A warmth touched the back of my neck. I froze. It was subtle at first. The way the air in a crowded room starts to feel thick with heat. But then it grew stronger, stifling, oppressive, like the inside of a sauna, except there was no steam. No moisture, just heat, dry and suffocating. I reached up, swiping my hand across my forehead. My skin was damp, my shirt sticking to my back. My breathing came shorter, faster. I turned back to the mirror. Still me, still the elevator. But the heat, God, the heat. It was unbearable now. I stumbled backward, reaching out to brace myself against the wall. But when my hand touched it, it wasn't concrete, it wasn't solid, it was warm. Soft, like flesh. I yanked my hand away, spinning to look. The elevator was gone. No, not gone. Changed. The walls were wrong. No longer chalky gray concrete, no longer smooth and predictable. Instead, they pulsed, wet and raw. Layers of speckled red and purple flesh stretched in folds around me, twitching, convulsing. The floor beneath me was slick, almost sticky, and the air was thick with something worse than heat now. A smell, putrid, sickly sweet and rotten, like meat left out in the sun for days. Like vomit, like decay. My stomach clenched, my sinuses burned, my eyes watered, and then a sound. A deep, guttural retching. I turned back to the mirror. My reflection was still there. But the elevator behind it, the normal elevator, was there too. Like a window into the world I knew, the world I belonged in. People were getting in, pressing buttons, talking, laughing. I wasn't in it, I was here. Inside asterisk, this asterisk. And the walls, they were asterisk moving asterisk. closing in. The retching sound grew louder, wet and hungry. Something was swallowing me whole. I tried to scream, but the heat was in my throat now, choking me, suffocating me. The walls convulsed, and I felt my feet slip. The floor was shifting beneath me. Opening up, I fell. And then, nothing. Silence. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the normal elevator. A man was shaking my shoulder, his face lined with concern. "Miss, are you okay?" I blinked up at him, my body trembling, my skin still slick with sweat. The elevator doors were open. The light from the hallway spilled in, warm and safe. I was on the 8th floor. I scrambled up and stumbled out, my legs barely holding me. The man watched me go, his expression wary. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't use the elevator anymore. I take the stairs. Please take the stairs too, please. I woke up drenched in sweat. My sheets clung to me like damp skin, and my breath came in short, shallow gasps. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The darkness of my grandparents' apartment pressed in around me, heavy and unfamiliar. I'd forgotten to close the curtains, and through the open window, the city flickered with distant lights, casting faint, restless shadows on the ceiling. The dream, if it was a dream, had followed me here. The smell still lingered in my nose, that awful, rotting stench. My throat was raw, like I had swallowed something foul in my sleep. I swallowed hard, forcing down the nausea twisting in my stomach. I sat up slowly, my muscles aching with exhaustion. The room felt too quiet. Not the comforting silence of sleep, but a hollow, expectant stillness, like something was waiting. I turned to check my phone. 3:12 a.m. I let out a shaky breath and rubbed my face with my hands. I needed water. Maybe if I got up, moved around, I could shake off the feeling creeping over my skin like an unseen film. Swinging my legs over the side of the bed, I hesitated. The apartment was dark, too dark. My grandparents always left the hallway light on, just a small glow to keep the place from feeling like a tomb at night. But now, nothing, just pitch black emptiness beyond my bedroom door. Something felt wrong. I stood slowly, listening. The wooden floor creaked under my weight, but the rest of the apartment was silent. No hum of the refrigerator, no faint ticking of the old kitchen clock. Just stillness. I stepped out into the hallway. The air was thick, like the heat from the elevator had followed me here. I ran my hand along the wall, searching for the light switch. My fingers fumbled against the plastic, flipping it up and down. Nothing. My stomach tightened. The power must have gone out. That had to be it. It was an old building. The wiring wasn't great. But even as I told myself that, I felt my skin crawl with unease. A sound broke the silence. A soft, wet sound, like something heavy shifting against a damp surface. It came from the living room. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wanted to turn back, to crawl under my covers, and pretend I had never left my bed. But my feet carried me forward. Slowly, carefully, I edged toward the living room, the darkness pressing against me like a living thing. As I reached the doorway, I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. Something was there, a shape darker than the shadows around it, standing by the window. It wasn't moving. It wasn't breathing. It was just watching. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze, heavy, unrelenting. I stepped back. My heels scuffed against the floor, and the thing twitched, just a fraction. But it was enough. The air in the room changed, thickening with something unseen but palpable. The same heat from the elevator, suffocating and relentless. My skin prickled. The thing by the window shifted again, and I heard it. A low, wet retching. The same sound from before, from inside the elevator. My chest tightened, my legs locked. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The thing twitched again, its outline distorting, unraveling like something struggling to hold its shape. And then it took a step forward, a single shuddering step. The floor groaned beneath it. I gasped, stumbling backward, my body finally breaking free of its paralysis. My foot caught on the rug, and I fell hard onto my back. Pain shot up my spine, but I barely registered it. The thing moved again. Another step, closer now. It wasn't walking, it was dragging itself, like it didn't fully understand how to use its limbs. I scrambled backward, my hands clawing at the floor. My heart pounded so violently I thought it would burst from my chest. The thing loomed over me now, its shape still shifting, unfocused, like a bad signal trying to resolve into an image. A hand reached for me. Long, wrong. The fingers too thin, too many joints. The smell hit me full force. Rot, meat, pus. I choked, my vision blurring with tears. The thing bent toward me, and in the dim glow of the city lights, I saw something move inside it. A face. No, not one. Many. Pressing against the surface like something trying to break free. Their mouths opened, silent and screaming. I don't remember, or making the decision to move, but suddenly I was on my feet running. The hallway stretched before me, too long, too unfamiliar. My hands fumbled for the bedroom door, yanking it open, slamming it shut behind me. I pressed my back against it, my breath ragged. The floor felt unsteady beneath me, like I was still in motion, still trapped in that impossible pulsing space inside the elevator. A sound. Not the retching this time. Something else. A whisper, low, indistinct, like voices behind a closed door. And then, a knock. Soft, gentle, right against my bedroom door. I clamped my hands over my mouth, forcing myself to stay silent. Another knock. The whispering grew louder. The same garbled, wet sound, like something speaking through waterlogged lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing myself harder against the wood. And then, silence. Nothing. The air shifted, the heaviness lifted. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my entire body trembling. When I finally found the courage to open my eyes, the first light of dawn was creeping through the window. The apartment was quiet, normal. I didn't move until I heard my grandmother stirring in the kitchen. The familiar clink of dishes, the soft murmur of the radio. I forced myself to stand, my legs weak beneath me. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob. Slowly I turned it. The hallway was empty, no signs of anything, no darkness, no shape, no smell. But I knew it had been there, and it was still watching. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on my bed with my back pressed against the wall, staring at the door, waiting for another knock, another whisper, another shift in the air that would tell me it was still there. But nothing came. The city woke up outside, the low hum of traffic and voices rising like a slow tide, washing away the unnatural stillness that had filled the apartment hours before. When my grandmother finally called me for breakfast, I hesitated. I didn't want to leave the room. Stepping into that hallway again felt like stepping into the unknown, into something that wasn't entirely mine anymore. But I couldn't stay in here forever. I forced myself up, gripping the doorknob with sweaty fingers. The hallway was just a hallway. Sunlight stretched across the wooden floor, creeping in through the lace curtains my grandmother had hung years ago. The living room was just a living room. The couch, the old TV set, the bookshelves filled with fading hardcovers. No shadows, no figures, no sounds, but something still felt wrong. My grandmother turned when I entered the kitchen, smiling. "You came home so late last night? Were you out with friends?" I swallowed. My throat was still raw, my stomach unsettled. "Yeah," she hummed, setting down a plate of eggs and bread in front of me. "You look pale. You should eat." I tried, I really did, but every bite turned to paste in my mouth. The food tasted off, like it had been left sitting in the heat for too long. My grandfather sat across from me, flipping through a newspaper, muttering about politics. Everything was normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of something lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, waiting for me to let my guard down. When I left the apartment later that morning, I hesitated in front of the elevator. The metal door stood there, harmless and ordinary, with its small, round window, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. My fingers hovered over the button before I clenched them into a fist and stepped back. I took the stairs. It felt ridiculous, making my way down 8 flights like a child avoiding the deep end of a pool. The stairwell smelled like dust and old paint, My footsteps echoed against the concrete walls, each step feeling heavier than the last. I tried not to think about the elevator, about the impossible place I had been trapped inside, about the thing that had reached for me in the dark. But when I reached the lobby, something made me stop. The old woman who sat at the front desk was staring at me. She was always there, a fixture of the building, watching everything with sharp, knowing eyes. People said she had lived here longer than anyone, that she had seen the city change and grow around her. Today, those sharp eyes felt different. She leaned forward slightly, her wrinkled hands resting on the desk. "You took the stairs," she said. It wasn't a question. I swallowed. "Yeah." Her gaze didn't waver. "You should keep doing that." The words sent a cold ripple down my spine. I opened my mouth to ask her what she meant, but she was already looking away, turning her attention back to whatever paperwork she was pretending to work on. I stepped outside, the weight of her words pressing against me. The streets were bright and busy, the smell of fresh bread and car exhaust filling the air. I tried to lose myself in the movement of the city, in the noise, in the warmth of the sun on my face. But the feeling stayed with me, like a stain I couldn't wash off. I spent the day wandering, trying to shake the memory of the night before, of the thing in the living room, of the suffocating heat inside the elevator. But every alleyway felt too dark. Every passing reflection in a shop window felt like something watching me just out of sight. By the time I returned to my grandparents' building, the sun was setting. I stood at the entrance, staring at the elevator again. Someone had drawn a new number on the metal door in marker, covering the faded scribbles of past tenants. The button glowed red, waiting to be pressed. I turned away. The stairwell was dimly lit, the flickering bulbs overhead buzzing faintly. The first few flights were fine. My shoes tapped against the concrete, my breath steady. The air smelled musty, but normal. Then, around the fourth floor, the temperature changed. A familiar warmth pressed against my skin, seeping into my clothes. The hair on my arms stood up. My breath hitched. I kept walking, faster now, my pulse thudding against my ribs. Fifth floor, sixth. The heat grew thicker, wrapping around me, squeezing. My vision blurred, sweat beating at my temples. Seventh floor. I could hear something now. A soft, wet sound. A retching noise. I didn't look back. I ran. My feet slammed against the concrete, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound followed me, closer now, as if something was just behind me, dragging itself up the stairs. Eighth floor. I nearly crashed into the door, yanking it open, stumbling into the hallway. The apartment door was just ahead. My fingers fumbled with the key, the metal slipping against my damp skin. Behind me, the stairwell was silent, but the heat hadn't faded. I forced the key into the lock, turning it with a sharp click. The door swung open and I rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. My grandmother looked up from the couch, startled. "You're sweating. Are you okay?" I forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, just took the stairs." She frowned but didn't question it. I muttered something about needing a shower and hurried to the bathroom. The cold water felt like salvation, washing away the sweat, the fear, the lingering touch of something I didn't want to name. I stayed under the stream until my skin was numb, until my heartbeat slowed. When I finally stepped out, wrapping a towel around myself, I felt better. Lighter, but then I looked up. The bathroom mirror was fogged over from the steam. And there, in the center, drawn in the condensation, were 4 long, thin scratches. Not letters, not words, just lines, like something had dragged its fingers across the glass. I stared, my breath caught in my throat. Behind me, the air shifted, and the heat returned. I stood frozen, water dripping from my skin. The towel clutched tightly around me. The scratches on the mirror glistened in the dim bathroom light, fresh and deliberate. The air was thick again, heavy with that unnatural warmth. My breath came in shallow bursts, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. I told myself it was nothing. Condensation playing tricks on my eyes. Maybe I had done it myself without realizing. Maybe the glass had been dirty. Maybe. A drop of water slid down from one of the scratches, carving a path through the fogged surface. I turned around slowly. The bathroom door was closed. The small window above the sink was latched shut. There was no movement, no shadow, no sign that anything had been here. But I felt it. I gripped the edge of the sink, grounding myself. I focused on the sound of my own breathing, the distant murmur of the TV in the living room, the city noises drifting in from outside. Normal sounds, real sounds. I reached out with a shaking hand and wiped the mirror clean with my towel. The scratches disappeared. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed, pale, lips pressed into a thin line. I searched my own face, looking for something, anything that would prove I was still me. Then my reflection blinked. I didn't. I stumbled backward, knocking over a bottle of shampoo that clattered against the tiled floor. The reflection held my gaze, its eyes too dark, too hollow. Then, slowly, deliberately, it smiled. I didn't. The corners of its mouth stretched too far, revealing too many teeth. I turned away, grabbed the doorknob, and wrenched it open. The heat rushed out behind me, chasing me into the hallway. The apartment felt colder now. My grandmother was still watching TV. My grandfather was still flipping through his newspaper, the world moving as if nothing had happened. I forced myself to walk, to breathe, to pretend that I wasn't shaking. I locked my seat. Up in my room, pressing my back against the door, I needed to think. None of this made sense. The elevator, the thing in the living room, the heat, the sound, the scratches in the mirror, my reflection. I squeezed my eyes shut. I had to be imagining things. Maybe I was sick. Maybe I had a fever. Maybe... A soft knock on my bedroom door. I stopped breathing. The knock came again, gentle, almost hesitant. My grandmother's voice. "Are you okay?" I hesitated, swallowing hard. "Yeah," I called back. My voice sounded too thin. "Just tired?" A pause, then, "All right, get some rest." I listened to her footsteps retreat down the hallway, the creak of the couch as she sat back down. I exhaled slowly, pressing my forehead against the cool wood of the door. Then, from the other side, a whisper. Not my grandmother. Not her voice. Something else. The same wet, garbled murmur I had heard in the stairwell. I jerked away, stumbling backward, my pulse pounding. The whispering continued, too low to make out the words, but thick and bubbling, like something speaking from underwater. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. Then just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. I stayed awake all night, listening. By morning, I had made a decision. I needed to know what was happening. I needed to understand, or I was going to lose my mind. I spent the next day in a haze, moving through the motions of normalcy, while my mind spiraled in the background. My grandmother chatted over breakfast. My grandfather went about his quiet routine. The city outside carried on as if nothing had changed, as if I wasn't unraveling, as if there wasn't something in this building that had noticed me. I needed answers. I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. That evening, when my grandparents fell asleep, I left the apartment. The hallway was silent, washed in the dim glow of the overhead lights. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the elevator. The small round window was dark, showing nothing of what waited inside. I turned away. I took the stairs. Each step down felt heavier, like I was descending into something unseen, something waiting. The further I went, the more the air thickened, the warmth pressing against me again, sticking to my skin. I gripped the railing, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, at the fourth floor landing, I stopped. The stairwell stretched longer than it should have. The shadows seemed deeper. The walls had lost their usual textures, moved into something that looked soft, damp, like flesh. I took a step back. The sound of my foot hitting the ground echoed unnaturally, warping as if the space around me had changed. A low retching sound drifted from below. I turned, bolting up the stairs, taking them two at a time, my breath ragged. 7th floor, 8th. I nearly crashed into the door, fumbling with the handle, yanking it open. I expected the safety of my grandparents' hallway, the warm yellow walls, the familiar creak of the floorboards. But I stepped into something else. The apartment was gone. The hallway was wrong, the walls pulsed, dark and veined, stretching endlessly in both directions. The lights flickered, dimmer, sickly. I wasn't home. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. I turned back to the stairwell, but the door was gone. Just more of the endless hallway, stretching into the dark. I backed away, my breath shallow, my body shaking. A whisper rose from the silence, low, wet, bubbling. It was coming from the mirror at the end of the hall, the same mirror from the elevator, the small square one with the red frame. But this time, my reflection wasn't mine. It stood there, staring at me, but the eyes were empty, the mouth twisted too wide, revealing rows of two sharp teeth. Then slowly it raised a hand and pointed behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. The air thickened. The heat pressed in. The walls groaned. A breath, warm and rotten, exhaled against the back of my neck. I squeezed my eyes shut. Then the whispering stopped. The heat faded. I opened my eyes. I was standing in my grandparents' hallway. The real one. The yellow walls, the creaky floorboards, the door to our apartment just a few steps away. The mirror was gone. The air was cool again. Normal. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there, breathing, trying to understand if what had happened was real or just another crack forming in my mind. Finally, with shaking hands, I reached for the doorknob and stepped inside. My grandmother was in the kitchen, humming softly, as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just been somewhere else entirely. I didn't tell her. I didn't tell anyone. I packed my things the next morning. I told my grandparents I needed to leave early this year, that something had come up back home. They were sad, but they didn't press. I took the stairs one last time, forcing myself not to run. As I passed the front desk, the old woman looked up at me. She nodded once, like she understood, like she had always known. I stepped out into the sunlight, breathing in the fresh air, letting it fill my lungs. I didn't look back. I don't know what that place was. I don't know if it was waiting for me. But I know one thing. It let me go. This time. It started as a dare, the way these things always do. 4 of us, me, Luke, Josh, and Olivia, standing at the edge of the forest, shivering from more than just the cold. The town had whispered about the tunnel for years. A cursed place. A passage between worlds. A trap for the foolish. And here we were, being exactly that. Luke was the one who pushed it. He always did. He grinned at me, his breath curling in the freezing air. Come on, Mason, you're not scared, are you? I was. We all were. But no one wanted to admit it. So we went in. The tunnel wasn't a real tunnel, not in the way most people think. It was a stretch of forest where the trees had twisted together, branches locking like fingers, forming a black corridor that swallowed the light. Even in daylight, it looked wrong. At midnight, under the full moon, it was something else entirely. The second we stepped inside, the wind changed. The air was colder, thick, like walking into deep water. The branches above swayed even though there was no breeze. It felt like something breathing, watching. Keep walking, Olivia whispered. She had read about the tunnel before. She knew the rules. Don't stop, don't turn around. I glanced back over my shoulder anyway. The entrance was already farther than it should have been, a shrinking pinprick of light swallowed by darkness. Something rustled to my right. Josh cursed under his breath. Did you hear that? We all had, but there was nothing there. Just trees, just shadows. The silence grew heavier the deeper we went. No crickets, no wind, just the crunch of our boots on frozen leaves. The tunnel stretched longer than it should have. What should have been a 5-minute walk stretched to 10, 15, 30. The darkness pressed against us, the trees shifting when we weren't looking. Then the whispers started, soft at first, the kind of sound that made you doubt yourself. Then clearer, turn back, go back, you don't belong here. Luke let out a shaky laugh. Okay, yeah, this is messed up. The trees groaned above us, wood stretching like old bones. I felt something brush against my arm. A branch? No, something warmer, softer. I yanked away, heart slamming in my chest. Just keep walking. The tunnel narrowed. The branches arched lower, twisting toward us, their tips curving like fingers. The ground beneath us wasn't dirt anymore. It was damp, wrong, like flesh. And then, the entrance behind us disappeared. Josh let out a choked breath. Where is it? There was no going back now. The only way was forward. The whispers turned to laughter, dry and hollow. The kind of laughter you hear in the moment before something terrible happens. I didn't realize I was shaking until Olivia grabbed my wrist, her nails digging into my skin. "It's almost over," she whispered. "It has to be." She was right, because suddenly the tunnel ended. We stepped out into a forest that wasn't the one we had left behind. The moon overhead was impossibly large, looming in the sky like an eye. The trees were taller, their trunks slick, with something black and pulsing. The air was thick with the sound of insects, a low, constant hum that vibrated in my skull. The ground writhed beneath us, a moving, crawling mass of beetles and centipedes, legs skittering in every direction. Josh swore violently, stepping back. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But it was. We had made it through the tunnel, but we weren't safe, because now we had to find the witch. None of us spoke. The air was thick, charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. The moon cast everything in sharp silver, making the twisted trees look skeletal, their branches clawing at the sky. The forest didn't feel abandoned. It felt occupied, watched. Luke was the first to move. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the dark. "Where the hell are we?" Nobody answered. We all knew. This wasn't our forest anymore. It looked similar but wrong in ways I couldn't describe. The trees had faces if you looked at them too long, knots and shadows forming deep-set eyes and twisted mouths. The ground wasn't solid anymore. It gave under my boots, like stepping on something that wasn't quite dead. The buzzing of insects grew louder. Not normal buzzing. It was rhythmic, layered, almost like whispering. Then the path split, two directions, two possibilities. Both looked the same, narrow dirt trails winding into the blackened trees. But one of them was wrong. I swallowed hard. "Olivia, what do we do?" She didn't answer right away. Her face was pale, eyes darting between the paths, fingers twisting nervously in the hem of her jacket. "We need to find the crow." Luke scoffed. "A crow? Seriously?" But then we saw it, perched high in the skeletal branches, black feathers ruffled against the windless air. Its eyes were two large, gleaming like wet stones. It tilted its head, watching us with something more than intelligence. It felt knowing. Then it cawed, loud and sharp, echoing through the trees. It flapped its wings and moved, hopping down a few branches, clearly indicating the left path. Josh exhaled. "Guess that's our answer." Luke hesitated, his mouth pressed into a hard line, eyes flicking to the other path. "What if it's a trick?" "It's not," Olivia whispered. "We follow the crow." I took the first step. The second we moved to the wrong path, the one we didn't take, disappeared, just gone. Trees twisted, shifted, swallowed it whole. The forest sealed the choice. There was no going back. Luke saw it happen and went rigid. "Okay, I take it back. That was messed up." We kept walking. The deeper we went, the heavier the air became. The buzzing insects never stopped. Shapes moved between the trees, flickering at the edges of my vision. Too tall, too thin, not human. Every time I turned to look, they were gone. Then we reached the lake. It stretched before us, black as ink, thick fog rolling over its surface. The moon's reflection rippled, distorted, like something was moving beneath it. The crow landed on a jagged rock near the shore, waiting. Olivia spoke first. "We have to wait." "For what?" Luke asked, voice tight. "The fog. It has to clear." So we stood there, staring at the water, at the shifting shadows underneath. My pulse pounded in my ears. It felt like waiting for a trap to spring. Then, without warning, the fog peeled away, and I saw myself in the water, older, thinner, eyes sunken with exhaustion, face lined with years I hadn't yet lived. My own reflection staring back, but it wasn't just me. Something else was in the water. Behind me, I opened my mouth to scream, and the reflection moved on its own. It leaned forward, lips parting, and then in a voice rough and distant, my own voice whispered, "Ask your question." My body locked up. My brain screamed to look away, to turn, to run, but I couldn't. The water held me, its black depths waiting. I had to ask. One question, one truth I swallowed hard. My throat felt raw, my hands trembling. Then before I could stop myself, I whispered the words that had burned in the back of my mind since stepping into this cursed place. How do I get out of here? My reflection smiled, not a comforting smile, not reassuring, a knowing, pitying smile. And then it answered, You don't. The second the words left its mouth, the lake erupted. The reflection shattered, rippling into chaos. Something asterisk moved asterisk beneath the water, something massive, its form stretching deep into the blackness. The moonlight caught on wet, glistening skin, something rising, unfolding. And then the crow screamed, a harsh, human-like wail. I staggered back, choking on my own breath, my pulse hammering as the ground beneath us began to shake. Go, Olivia hissed. Now. We turned, and the crow was gone. In its place stood the witch, tall and thin, cloaked in tattered black, her sunken face barely visible beneath the heavy hood. One bony hand gripped a gnarled staff. The wood twisted like the trees. He raised a finger, crooking it toward us, beckoning. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to go near her. But we had no choice. The forest had already decided. We had made it this far. And now we had to follow. She didn't walk. She drifted. Her long, tattered cloak barely brushed the forest floor as she moved, leading us deeper into the woods. The air was thicker here, pressing against my lungs like a damp cloth. The buzzing of insects had faded, replaced by something worse. Silence. No wind. No rustling leaves. No sound except the soft, rhythmic tap of her staff against the ground. None of us spoke. Not even Luke. We followed her, keeping our distance, our footsteps careful and uncertain. I tried not to look at her directly. Olivia had warned us. Don't look her in the face, asterisk. I kept my eyes on the gnarled staff, on the ground, on the endless stretch of trees that no longer looked like trees at all. Then she stopped. We nearly ran into her, skidding to a halt just in time. She stood beneath the tallest tree I had ever seen, its twisted trunk stretching into the night sky. Its bark was black and cracked, oozing something thick and dark. The air here smelled different, sweet almost, but not in a good way. She turned to us. I kept my gaze low, focusing on the thin, claw-like fingers that gripped the staff. One of you must pay the price, she said. Her voice was dry, brittle, like old leaves crumbling underfoot. It sent a shiver through me, deep and primal. Luke let out a nervous laugh. Price? What kind of price? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she lifted one hand and pointed at us. Our sleeve slipping back to reveal a skeletal arm, skin stretched thin over bone. You entered my woods. You asked for knowledge. Now you owe me a favor. Josh swallowed hard. What kind of favor? The witch tilted her head, the hood shifting just enough to show a glimpse of her face. I caught a flicker of hollow, sunken cheeks, skin so pale it was almost gray. I snapped my eyes back down before I saw too much. It will be different for each of you, she rasped. A task, a duty, a debt that must be paid before the next moonrise. Olivia's breathing was shallow. And if we don't? The witch took a slow step toward her. You won't have to worry about that, she whispered. The air around us seemed to constrict. My stomach twisted with something cold and awful. I didn't need to ask what she meant. She stretched out her hand. Palm up. Swear it now. A promise made in these woods cannot be broken. I looked at the others. Olivia's hands were clenched into fists. Josh was sweating despite the cold. Even Luke, always the fearless one, looked pale. But there was no other option. One by one, we stepped forward and placed our hands in hers. Her skin was ice cold, her fingers pressing against ours, like brittle twigs. The moment my skin touched hers, something asterisk shifted asterisk inside me, like a thread being pulled, a knot tightening in my gut. It was done. She let go and stepped back. Go home, she said. Sleep. When you wake, you will know what must be done. And then she turned and walked away. The forest seemed to exhale. The air lightened. The tension broke. The next thing I knew, we were standing at the edge of the woods, back in our world, the normal world. The witch's tunnel loomed behind us, dark and silent. We had made it out, but something followed us. Something unseen, unfelt. A weight in the back of my mind, whispering that the worst was yet to come. I didn't sleep. None of us did. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the weight in my chest to ease, for the tightness in my skull to loosen. It didn't. The witch had taken something from me, from all of us, and I could feel it. An invisible hook lodged deep in my ribs, tethering me to something I didn't understand. At some point, exhaustion won. My eyelids drooped a bit, and I slipped into a restless, feverish sleep. And then I dreamed. No, not a dream, something else, something asterisk given asterisk to me. I stood in a field of dead grass, the air thick with rot. The sky above was wrong, the stars too bright, too sharp, shifting in unnatural patterns. The tallest tree from the witch's forest stood before me, black bark cracked open like wounds, leaking something thick and slow, and at its base, something weighted asterisk. I didn't want to see it. My body screamed asterisk, look away, don't look asterisk. But I couldn't. It was human, or it had been once. But now it was something broken, something unfinished. Its skin was gray and waxy, stretched too tight over its bones. Its arms were too long, fingers ending in ragged nails. It had no eyes, just empty sockets that asterisk wept a asterisk, a dark, sluggish fluid. It opened its mouth. A voice like wind through dead leaves rasped from its throat. Bring me the book. I woke with a jolt, gasping. My sheets were damp with sweat, my head pounding. My room was silent, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. But I wasn't alone. The weight was still there. That asterisk things, asterisk voice still echoed in my skull. I knew what I had to do. The witch's favor. I reached for my phone with shaking hands. A message from Olivia. Asterisk, I saw it too. Another from Josh. Asterisk. What the hell is happening? Luke didn't text. I wasn't sure if that was better or worse. I forced myself to sit up, pushing down the nausea twisting in my stomach. The command echoed in my mind. Asterisk, bring me the book. I didn't know what book. I didn't know where, but I knew. I just knew that if I didn't find it, something worse than nightmares would come for me. Morning came too fast. I met Olivia and Josh outside a coffee shop. Our faces pale, our eyes hollow. None of us touched our drinks. You both saw it? Olivia asked, voice hoarse. I nodded. Josh swallowed hard. Mine didn't talk. It just looked at me like it was waiting. A sick feeling churned in my gut. What about Luke? Olivia shook her head. No one's heard from him. A cold wind blew through the street. I shivered. He didn't text back, I muttered. That's not like him. Josh's fingers drummed against the table. What if he didn't wake up? The words made my stomach drop. I grabbed my keys. We're going to his house. We drove in silence, the city passing by in a blur. Luke's house was in the nicer part of town, the kind of place where nothing bad was asterisk supposed asterisk to happen. But as soon as we pulled up, I knew something was wrong. The blinds were drawn. The house was asterisk to asterisk quiet. No music blasting from his room, no sound of his mom cooking in the kitchen. I knocked, no answer. Josh tried calling, the ringtone muffled behind the door. Then Olivia pointed. The door! It's open. A sliver of darkness gaped between the frame and the wood. We stepped inside. The air was wrong, heavy, stale. The whole house smelled like damp earth, like something had been buried beneath the floorboards and left to rot. The curtains were drawn, the living room cast in shadows. I swallowed hard. Luke? No response. We moved through the house slowly, tension pressing against my skull. The kitchen was empty. So was the hallway. Then we reached his room. The door was ajar. The smell was stronger here. Josh pushed it open. And there was Luke, sitting on the edge of his bed, perfectly still, facing away from us. His back was too rigid, his hands resting on his knees, fingers curled, like he was gripping something that wasn't there. "Luke?" Olivia whispered. No answer. I stepped closer, my heart hammering. "Hey, man, are you—" He turned his head, and I saw his face. Or asterisk, what was left of it, asterisk. His skin was gray, sagging like wet paper, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. His lips were cracked, barely concealing teeth that were too sharp, too long, and his eyes were empty, bottomless sockets that wept black, tar-like tears. The same face from my dream. Josh made a strangled noise. Olivia grabbed my arm. "Mason," she whispered, "we need to go." Luke's mouth twitched, and then in a voice that wasn't his, he rasped, "Where is the book?" My stomach twisted. The room swayed around me. I didn't answer. I couldn't answer. I didn't know. Luke, or the thing inside him, leaned forward. His fingers twitched. His lips peeled back, and something that wasn't a smile. "You don't have much time," he whispered. The shadows in the room stretched. The air turned thick. And then Luke lunged. We ran. I don't remember getting to the car. I don't remember how we made it down the hall. Past the walls that seemed to breathe. Past the shadows that stretched unnaturally across the floor. 1 second we were in Luke's room, watching something that asterisk used to be him. Asterisk crawl toward us, on hands that weren't hands anymore. The next, we were outside, slamming the car doors shut, our breathing ragged, hands shaking too hard to grip anything properly. Josh turned the key. The engine roared to life, and he floored it, tires screeching against the pavement. I twisted in my seat, half expecting Luke, or whatever had taken his place, to burst through the front door, to come crawling after us with that gaping, leaking face. But the house remained still, silent, swallowing its secrets whole. We didn't speak until we were miles away. Even then, none of us knew what to say. "Did you hear what he said?" Olivia's voice was barely above a whisper. "The book. It's the book. That's what it wants." Josh gripped the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. "What book? We don't even know what we're looking for." But I knew, or at least I had an idea. The library, the old section, the part no one ever went to anymore, where the dust lay thick on shelves, filled with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. The way you know when you're dreaming that something terrible is behind a door before you open it. I swallowed hard. "I think I know where it is." We didn't argue. We just went. The library was dark, closed for the night, but that didn't stop us. We parked in the back, scaling the old metal fire escape until we reached a window that had been left cracked open. We climbed inside one by one, our footsteps muffled against the old carpet. The place smelled like paper and dust, like time itself had settled here and refused to move. We moved through the aisles quickly, past rows of forgotten books, past corners where the light didn't quite reach. The deeper we went, the heavier the air became. Then I saw it. At the end of the aisle, resting on an old wooden podium. A single book, bound in something dark and cracked, like leather left out in the sun too long. No title, no markings. But I knew. Asterisk. This was it. A whisper crawled along the back of my skull. A voice not my own. Asterisk. Take it, bring it to the tree. My fingers hovered over the cover. The air around us seemed to hum, the lights overhead flickering. I knew the moment I touched it, there was no turning back. But we had already crossed that line the second we stepped into the witch's tunnel. I grabbed the book. The moment my fingers closed around it, the entire library groaned. The walls trembled. The shadows lengthened, stretching unnaturally, shifting toward us like ink bleeding across the floor. And then, footsteps, not human, not normal, slow and deliberate, coming from all directions. Josh swore under his breath. "Mason, go!" I choked out. "Run." We did. We sprinted through the aisles, past shelves that seemed to lean toward us, past corners where something asterisk moved, asterisk just out of sight. I clutched the book to my chest, feeling its weight, its wrongness. The moment we burst through the window and hit the pavement outside, the air, changed asterisk. The pressure lifted, the unseen presence retreating. The book was still in my hands, heavier now, pulsing with something I didn't want to understand. "We have to go back," Olivia gasped. "To the tree! We have to finish this." We didn't waste time. The drive back to the forest was a blur. The tunnel loomed before us, dark and waiting. The branches above twisted and creaked. Asterisk. Hungry. Asterisk. This time, we didn't hesitate. We stepped inside. The path was shorter now, the forest no longer pretending to be anything other than what it was. The moment we reached the clearing, the tree was waiting. The black bark glistened, its cracked surface yawning open like a mouth. And the witch was there. She stood in front of the tree, watching us with eyes too deep, too endless. She stretched out a hand. "Give me the book," she whispered. I hesitated. The weight of it in my hands was unbearable now. The pages humming, with something asterisk alive asterisk. I didn't want to know what was inside. I didn't want to know who had written it, but I had no choice. I stepped forward and placed it in her hand. The second she touched it, the forest asterisk exhaled asterisk. The air shifted, the weight lifted, the book vanished into the folds of her cloak, disappearing as if it had never been. "You have repaid your debt," she said. "You may leave." Her voice carried no warmth, no relief, just a statement of fact. She turned, walked into the trees, disappeared into the dark. And the path home was waiting. This time, when we stepped out of the witch's tunnel, the night felt asterisk, normal asterisk. The wind carried the scent of earth and leaves, not rot. The shadows didn't shift unnaturally. The world was the way it was asterisk, supposed asterisk to be. But something had changed. Luke was gone. His house empty, his phone disconnected. It was like he had never existed. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I swear I still feel it. That weight in the back of my mind. That whisper just beyond hearing. The witch doesn't forgive. She doesn't forget. And one day, I know she'll call on us again.